Before we begin tonight's story, I want to gently ask one small thing. If you truly enjoy these calm journeys into history, it would mean a lot if you left a like, and perhaps shared where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Only if it feels right for you. Thank you. The wind moves softly through the bamboo groves of old Japan, rustling leaves that have witnessed centuries of change. In the distance, a temple bell rings once, then falls silent. The sound carries across misty valleys, where rice fields stretch toward mountains wrapped in morning fog. This is a land of beauty and tradition, a place where cherry blossoms fall like snow in spring, where the seasons turn with quiet ceremony, and where the earth itself seems to breathe with ancient memory. But there was a time when this land knew little peace, a time when warlords carved the islands into 100 warring territories, when castles stood like lonely sentinels over villages that never knew which banner would fly overhead from one season to the next. For more than a century, Japan was a fractured mirror, each piece reflecting ambition, survival, and the endless human longing for security in an uncertain world. This is the story of the man who would gather those pieces, who would wait with the patience of mountains, who would outlive his rivals not through cruelty, but through wisdom, and who would finally bring stillness to a land exhausted by war. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu, and though history remembers him as the shogun who united Japan, his journey began in the humblest of circumstances, in an age when survival itself was the greatest achievement. Let us travel back now to that distant time, to understand the world that shaped him, and the legacy he would leave behind. The year is 1467, nearly a century before our story's central figure draws his first breath. Japan is entering what historians will later call the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, though no one alive in that moment could have known they stood at such a threshold. They knew only that the old order was crumbling, that the authority of emperors and shoguns had become like morning mist, visible but impossible to grasp. For centuries, Japan had maintained a delicate balance of power. The emperor resided in Kyoto, a sacred but largely ceremonial figure, while real authority rested with the shogun, the military commander who ruled in the emperor's name. Below them, a complex hierarchy of daimyo, great lords who controlled vast territories, and samurai warriors who served them with codes of honor and loyalty. It was a system built on obligation and tradition, on bonds that were meant to last generations. But systems built by human hands are subject to human frailty. Wars of succession, disputes over land, the ambitions of powerful families, all these gradually weakened the ties that held the realm together. The Ashikaga shogunate, which had ruled since 1336, found its authority slipping like sand through fingers. Provincial lords grew stronger, their armies larger, their territories more independent. What had once been a unified nation became a patchwork of competing domains, each seeking advantage, each watching its neighbors with suspicion. The trigger, when it came, seemed almost insignificant in retrospect, a dispute over succession within the shogunate itself. But in the summer of 1467, that dispute erupted into open warfare in the streets of Kyoto. The Onin War, as it would be known, lasted 11 years and left the capital in ruins. Temples burned. Gardens that had taken generations to cultivate turned to ash. Refugees fled to the countryside, carrying tales of horror and loss. When the war finally ended in 1477, nothing was truly resolved. The shogunate survived in name only, a hollow shell of its former authority. But something more profound had been broken, the belief that any central power could enforce order across the realm. In the absence of that belief, a new reality emerged. The strong would rule, the weak would fall, and loyalty would flow, not to distant authorities, but to whoever could offer protection, rice, and the possibility of survival. This was the world of Gekkokujo, the low overcoming the high, where a talented general could overthrow his lord, where peasant sons could rise to become samurai, where the old certainties dissolved and new possibilities emerged from the chaos. It was a world both terrifying and strangely liberating, where merit and cunning mattered more than birth, though birth still mattered greatly. Across Japan, in every province and domain, families fortified their holdings. Castles multiplied on hilltops and strategic river crossings. Stone walls rose higher. Moats grew deeper. Every daimyo became a miniature king in his own territory, collecting taxes, dispensing justice, maintaining armies, forging alliances, and preparing for the inevitable conflicts that would test whether his house would endure or disappear into history's forgotten margins. The samurai class, which had always defined itself through loyalty and martial skill, found its values tested in this new age. Some remained faithful to their lords through every hardship, embodying the ideal of Bushido, the way of the warrior, even when it meant poverty or death. Others became ronin, masterless warriors who wandered the land, selling their swords to whoever could pay. And still others served new masters, pragmatically shifting allegiance when circumstances demanded it, understanding that in this fractured world, survival sometimes required flexibility. Trade continued despite the warfare, perhaps even flourished because of it. Merchants moved between domains, carrying goods and information. Port cities welcomed ships from China, Korea, and eventually from distant European lands. Firearms arrived in Japan in 1543, brought by Portuguese traders to the island of Tanegashima. Within decades, Japanese craftsmen had learned to manufacture these weapons themselves, and the arquebus, the matchlock rifle, began to change the nature of warfare, making castle walls both more necessary and more vulnerable. But amid all this change and conflict, the rhythms of agricultural life continued as they had for centuries. Farmers planted rice in spring and harvested in autumn. They paid their taxes to whoever controlled their region, tried to keep their sons from being conscripted, and prayed to Buddha and the kami for protection from both natural disasters and human cruelty. The wars of the great lords might rage across provinces, but the fundamental work of sustaining life went on, as patient and necessary as the turning of seasons. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines remained centers of spiritual life, offering continuity in an age of disruption. Monks and priests preserved learning, copied sutras, maintained gardens that represented paradise on earth, and provided counsel to lords and commoners alike. Some temples became wealthy and powerful, maintaining their own armies of warrior monks. Others remained humble mountain retreats where seekers could find temporary refuge from the world's turmoil. The arts endured, too, adapting to new patrons and circumstances. Tea ceremony developed as a practice that emphasized simplicity, mindfulness, and aesthetic refinement. In a world of constant conflict, the tea room became a space apart, where participants could experience a moment of harmony regardless of their status or the chaos beyond its walls. Poetry flourished, landscape painting reached new heights, theater evolved. Even in darkness, humans create beauty, perhaps especially in darkness. It was into this world, complex, violent, creative, unstable, and yet somehow still maintaining threads of continuity with Japan's ancient past, that the child who would become Tokugawa Ieyasu would be born. His arrival would come in 1543. The same year, firearms first reached Japan, though no one could have imagined that the infant born that January in a small castle in Imagawa province would one day end the chaos that had defined Japanese life for generations. The land waited, unknowing. The wars continued. Alliances formed and dissolved like patterns in smoke. And in the eastern provinces, in a region caught between larger powers, the stage was quietly being set for a story that would change everything. On the 26th day of the 12th month of 1542, by the old calendar, a child was born in Okazaki Castle in Mikawa province. The castle was modest compared to the great fortresses of more powerful lords, but it stood strong, its stone foundations solid, its wooden structures well maintained. Snow lay on the ground that winter day, covering the castle grounds in white silence, as if nature itself paused to mark the moment. The baby's birth name was Matsudaira Takechiyo. He entered the world as the son of Matsudaira Hirotada, a minor daimyo whose domain encompassed only a small portion of Mikawa province. His mother, Odai no Kata, was herself the daughter of a neighboring lord. The marriage had been strategic, as marriages among the samurai class always were, designed to strengthen alliances in a region where powerful neighbors threatened constantly. The Matsudaira clan was ancient, tracing its lineage back centuries, but antiquity of blood provided little security in the Sengoku period. Mikawa province lay between larger, more powerful domains, and the Matsudaira found themselves perpetually navigating between competing interests, trying to maintain independence while acknowledging the reality of limited strength. To the west lay the territories of the Oda clan. To the east, the Imagawa, one of the most powerful families in Japan, controlled Suruga and Totomi provinces. Young Takechiyo's childhood would be defined by this precarious position. When he was just 2 years old, his father made a fateful decision. Facing military pressure from the Oda clan, Hirotada sought formal alliance with the Imagawa. The Imagawa agreed, but such alliances always came with conditions. They required a guarantee of loyalty, a bond that could not easily be broken. They required a hostage. The practice of exchanging hostages among allied daimyo was common in this era. A lord's son or close relative would be sent to live at the court of an allied lord, educated and treated well, but always held as insurance against betrayal. If the sending lord broke the alliance or acted against his allies' interests, the hostage's life was forfeit. It was a system that made children into living contracts, their safety dependent on political decisions beyond their control. And so, at the age of 4, Takechiyo was prepared to leave his home. One can imagine the preparations, servants packing his belongings, his mother ensuring he had proper clothing, his father explaining as best one can to a small child why he must go away. Perhaps they told him it was an honor. Perhaps they told him he would return soon. Perhaps they simply held him close before the departure, knowing that childhood as he had known it was ending. But fate intervened before the journey could be completed. The small party escorting young Takechiyo to Imagawa territory was betrayed. Oda forces intercepted them, and the boy who was meant to be an Imagawa hostage became instead a prisoner of the Oda clan. He was taken to Owari province, to a castle where he would spend the next 2 years, separated not only from his parents, but from the very allies he was meant to cement bonds with. For a child of 4, then 5, then 6, this must have been profoundly disorienting. The rooms he knew, the faces of family retainers, his mother's voice, his father's presence, all were replaced by strangers who were not unkind, but who represented captivity nonetheless. He learned early that plans could fail, that the strongest intentions of adults could not always protect those they loved, that the world was unpredictable and often harsh. During these years in Oda custody, his father faced terrible pressure. The Imagawa, having expected to receive the boy as proof of alliance, instead saw the Matsudaira as either incompetent or treacherous. His father's position grew more desperate. The Oda, holding the child, suggested that if Hirotada would abandon his Imagawa alliance and join them instead, young Takechiyo could be returned. But breaking faith with the Imagawa would invite their wrath, and they were far more powerful than the Oda at that time. Hirotada made his choice. He refused to betray the Imagawa, even to regain his son. It was a decision that must have torn at him, but it was also the decision of a lord who understood that his word, once given, had to mean something, or he was nothing. Honor in that age wasn't merely an abstract ideal, but a practical necessity. A lord whose word could not be trusted would find himself without allies in a world where alliances meant survival. In 1549, when Takechiyo was 7 years old, his father died. Some sources suggest illness, others hint at assassination, but details are lost to time. What mattered was that the boy, still held by the Oda, had lost the father he had barely known. And with his father's death, the political landscape shifted again. The Imagawa, seeing opportunity, moved into Mikawa province. They installed their own officials to manage the Matsudaira domain, though they allowed the clan itself to continue in name. And they demanded again what they had been promised years before, the hostage who would seal the alliance. Negotiations were conducted, terms were arranged, and finally, at age 8, Takechiyo was released by the Oda and transferred to Imagawa custody. He arrived in Sumpu, the Imagawa capital, in 1550. After 4 years as an Oda prisoner, he now became an Imagawa hostage, a different status perhaps, but still a life defined by conditions beyond his control. Yet this change would prove transformative. The Imagawa were one of the most cultured and powerful clans in Japan, and their court at Sumpu was a center of learning and refinement. Imagawa Yoshimoto, the clan leader, was a sophisticated man who valued education and the traditional arts. Unlike some warrior lords who prized only martial prowess, Yoshimoto believed that a true leader needed cultivation of mind and spirit, as well as skill with the sword. Young Takechio, now living in Sumpu Castle, was given an education befitting a samurai of high rank. He studied the Chinese classics, the Confucian texts that formed the foundation of educated thought, teaching principles of governance, loyalty, filial piety, and moral cultivation. He learned to read and write with the fluid elegance expected at his class. He studied Japanese poetry and history, learning the stories of ancient heroes and the rise and fall of earlier dynasties. He learned calligraphy, each brushstroke a meditation on control and aesthetic judgment. He trained in martial arts, swordsmanship, horsemanship, archery, the use of the spear. He learned strategy, studying the tactics of ancient Chinese generals and the campaigns of Japanese warriors. He learned the elaborate etiquette of samurai society, the precise bows and forms of speech that marked one's place in the hierarchy, the rituals that gave structure to chaos. But perhaps most importantly, he learned by observation. He watched Imagawa Yoshimoto govern, saw how the lord maintained alliances, managed his vassals, dispensed justice, collected revenues, and presented himself to the world. He observed the counselors and generals who surrounded Yoshimoto, noting who had real influence and who merely held impressive titles. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to think before acting, to reveal nothing of his thoughts until the moment came, to reveal everything. The other hostages and young samurai at the Imagawa court became his companions, though companion is perhaps too warm a word for relationships forged in such circumstances. They were rivals, potential allies, fellow students in the hard school of survival. Among them were sons of other daimyo, each representing their family's fortunes, each aware that their conduct could determine whether their clans would prosper or fall. Young Takechio, who would soon receive a new name, as was customary, developed a reputation for quietness and diligence. He was not the most brilliant student, not the most skilled swordsman, not the most charming youth at court. But he was steady, reliable, observant. He endured hardships without complaint. He completed his duties without flourish or excuse. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he was becoming someone who could be trusted, which in that world was perhaps the most valuable quality of all. In 1555, at age 13, he underwent his coming-of-age ceremony and received a new name, Matsudaira Jirosaburo Motonobu. Later, he would take the name Motoyasu. These changes of name were significant markers of status and maturity in samurai culture, each name representing a new phase of life, new responsibilities, new recognition. He also married that year, at 13, which was not unusual for someone of his rank in that era. His bride, Lady Tsukiyama, was a relative of Imagawa Yoshimoto, chosen to further bind the Matsudaira clan to their Imagawa overlords. The marriage was political, as such marriages always were, but it was also the beginning of a family line that would shape Japanese history. In time, they would have children, though Motoyasu's duties often kept him distant from domestic life. During these formative years, he witnessed the peak of Imagawa power. Yoshimoto was expanding his territory, consolidating control over the eastern provinces, and beginning to look westward toward Kyoto itself. There were whispers, carefully worded conversations, hints that Yoshimoto harbored ambitions to restore order to the realm, perhaps even to claim the shogunate. Such ambitions required massive resources, careful planning, and the right moment. But young Motoyasu also learned a harder lesson during these years. That power, no matter how great it seems, is always more fragile than it appears. That the mighty can fall in a single day. That careful plans can shatter against unexpected events. That the future, for all our attempts to control it, remains fundamentally unknowable. He learned patience because he had no choice but to be patient. He learned to endure because endurance was the only path forward. He learned to think in terms of seasons and years rather than days and weeks. And he learned, perhaps most crucially, that survival was its own form of victory. That the leader who lived to see another spring had more options than the hero who died gloriously in autumn. The boy who had been taken from his father's castle at age 4, who had been held by 2 different clans as a guarantee of adult agreements he could not influence, who had lost his father and been separated from his mother. That boy was becoming a young man who understood deeply the costs of war, the value of alliances, the importance of keeping faith, and the necessity of patience. But his time as a hostage was not yet over. He would remain in Imagawa service for several more years, slowly earning greater responsibilities, being allowed to lead small military units in minor campaigns, proving his capability and loyalty. All the while he watched and learned, storing up lessons that would serve him in years to come. And then, in 1560, everything would change. The castle at Sumpu stood against the morning sky, its wooden structures dark against pale clouds. Inside its walls, the young man, now known as Matsudaira Motoyasu, woke before dawn, as he did every day, to the sound of temple bells echoing across the city. He was 17 years old, and the discipline of early rising had become as natural to him as breathing. In the quiet darkness before sunrise, he would meditate briefly, compose his thoughts, and prepare himself for the day's duties. The life of a young samurai in service to a great lord was structured by ritual and responsibility. Every action had its proper form, every relationship its prescribed boundaries. Motoyasu moved through these structures with the ease of long practice, but beneath that practiced surface, his mind was always working, always observing, always learning. In these years of his late adolescence, he was no longer simply a hostage, but a vassal, given real responsibilities and opportunities to prove his worth. Imagawa Yoshimoto, recognizing capability when he saw it, had begun to entrust Motoyasu with military commands. These were not major campaigns. No great lord would risk a crucial battle to an untested youth, but they were real enough. Border disputes to settle, minor fortresses to inspect, small forces to lead in support of larger operations. Each assignment was a test, though the tests were never announced as such. Could he maintain discipline among the men under his command? Could he assess terrain and choose good defensive positions? Could he manage supplies so that his force remained fed and equipped? without unnecessary drain on resources? Could he keep his head in the confusion of combat? Could he recognize when to press forward and when to withdraw? Could he write clear reports that communicated the essential facts without exaggeration or excuse? Motoyasu approached each assignment with the same steady diligence that had marked his character since childhood. He did not seek glory or dramatic gestures. He focused instead on competence, doing what needed to be done, ensuring his men were ready, completing his objectives, and returning with his force intact. In an age where many young samurai sought to prove themselves through individual acts of bravery, Motoyasu's approach was notably pragmatic. He valued results over reputation, effectiveness over elegance. This pragmatism was not cowardice. He fought when fighting was necessary, and contemporary accounts suggest he was personally skilled with sword and spear. But he did not confuse personal martial prowess with the larger responsibilities of leadership. A commander who fought in the front ranks might win personal honor, but if his death left his men leaderless, what had his honor achieved? Better to position oneself where one could observe the entire engagement, give orders, adjust to changing circumstances, and ensure victory. His education continued alongside these military assignments. In the evenings, he studied strategy with senior retainers, poring over accounts of famous battles, analyzing what had led to victory or defeat. He learned about logistics, how many men could be supplied from a given territory's rice production, how far an army could march in a day, how weather affected different types of campaigns. He studied castle construction, learning to recognize strong and weak points in fortifications, understanding how sieges unfolded over weeks and months. He also deepened his study of governance. War was important, certainly, but war was merely a tool for achieving political objectives. The real art of power lay in managing territories, maintaining the loyalty of vassals, ensuring justice that was both fair and effective, balancing the needs of samurai retainers with the productive capacity of farmers, fostering trade while maintaining security. Imagawa Yoshimoto's domain was one of the best governed in Japan, and Motoyasu observed carefully how this was achieved. During these years, he also began to develop relationships that would prove crucial in times to come. Among the Matsudaira retainers who served in Imagawa territory, he cultivated bonds of trust and mutual obligation. These were men who had known his father, who remembered the Matsudaira clan's former independence, who maintained loyalty to their young lord even while serving the Imagawa overlords. Men like Honda Tadakatsu, who would become one of history's most celebrated generals. Men like Sakai Tadatsugu, whose loyalty would never waver through decades of service. These relationships were built slowly, through shared experiences and careful attention. Motoyasu listened to his retainers, valued their counsel, remembered their families, attended to their concerns. He did not yet have the power to reward them greatly, but he could offer respect, could ensure they received credit for their achievements, could promise silently through his conduct that when he did have power, he would not forget those who had stood by him. He also maintained relationships with his Imagawa allies and fellow vassals, understanding that his fortunes remained tied to theirs. He participated in the social life of Yoshimoto's court, the formal banquets, the poetry gatherings, the ceremonial occasions that reinforced bonds among the lord's followers. He was not effusive or particularly charismatic in these settings, but he was reliable, thoughtful, appropriate in his conduct and speech. In 1558, Motoyasu was given command of a more significant military operation. A fortress in Terabe, in western Mikawa, was held by forces loyal to the Oda clan. Taking it would strengthen Imagawa control over the province and demonstrate Motoyasu's capability. The assignment was also a test of his loyalty. Mikawa was his homeland, and some might wonder whether he would truly fight against those who could be considered his neighbors. Motoyasu laid siege to Terabe with characteristic methodical patience. He did not waste men in frontal assaults, but instead cut off supply lines, positioned his forces to prevent relief, and waited for the defenders' situation to become untenable. When the fortress finally surrendered, he treated the defeated garrison with respect, allowing them to depart with their lives and personal possessions. This mercy was both strategic, creating a reputation for honorable conduct that would make future enemies more willing to surrender, and reflective of his personal inclination toward minimizing unnecessary death. The success at Terabe enhanced his standing considerably. Imagawa Yoshimoto praised him publicly and increased his responsibilities. More importantly, Motoyasu gained confidence in his own judgment. The operation had required him to make difficult decisions without immediate guidance from superior officers, and those decisions had proven sound. He was learning to trust his assessment of situations, to act decisively when action was needed, to accept responsibility for outcomes. But beneath these successes, beneath the steady progression of a promising young vassal's career, larger forces were gathering that would soon sweep away the relative stability he had known. Imagawa Yoshimoto's ambitions were growing. The great lord, at the height of his power, was preparing for his most audacious move yet, a march toward Kyoto, the ancient capital, with armies large enough to intimidate any rival. Such a campaign required extensive preparation. Troops had to be gathered from across Yoshimoto's territories. Supply lines needed to be established. Alliances had to be confirmed or negotiated. The timing had to be right. Moving too early, before preparations were complete, risked disaster. But waiting too long might allow rivals to strengthen their own positions. By early 1560, the preparations were complete. Imagawa Yoshimoto assembled an army of 25,000 men, an immense force by the standards of the era. The column, when it began its march, stretched for miles. Banners bearing the Imagawa crest fluttered in the spring breeze. The movement of so many men created its own weather, dust rising from thousands of feet, the rumble of supply wagons, the rhythmic cadence of marching. Motoyasu, now 18 years old, commanded a force within this great army. His role was significant, but not central. He would lead attacks on fortifications along the route, help secure the army's flanks, carry out the various tactical missions that a large campaign required. He was part of something much greater than himself, a historical moment that could reshape Japan's future. The army moved westward into territories controlled by the Oda clan. Several Oda fortresses fell quickly. their garrisons either surrendering or being overwhelmed by the Imagawa's numerical superiority. Confidence grew with each small victory. The sense spread through the ranks that they were participating in something momentous, that their lord would indeed reach Kyoto, that a new order would emerge. Motoyasu received orders to attack 2 fortresses, Washizu and Marun, that guarded approaches to the Oda heartland. These were modest structures, not the great castles that dominated some regions, but they were positioned strategically and needed to be taken. He led his men forward, conducted the assaults competently, and succeeded in capturing both fortifications. It was, from his perspective, another successful mission, another step in what seemed to be an inexorable march toward Imagawa triumph. Having completed his assignment, he sent messengers to report the victories to Imagawa Yoshimoto, who had established his headquarters in a place called Dengaku Hazama, a narrow gorge between hills where the main body of the army had stopped to rest during the humid heat of late May. The march had been long, the weather was oppressive, and Yoshimoto had decided to pause before the next phase of the campaign. Motoyasu and his men rested after taking the fortresses, tending to their wounded, securing their positions, waiting for further orders. The day was the 18th of May, 1560. The sky was heavy with clouds, suggesting rain. The air felt thick, charged with the tension that comes before storms, both natural and human. And then, in that gorge called Dengaku Hazama, something happened that no one in the vast Imagawa army had anticipated. The rain came suddenly that afternoon, as summer storms do, turning the world grey and muffled. In the gorge at Dengaku Hazama, Imagawa Yoshimoto's headquarters became a chaos of confusion. Warriors scattered for shelter. The sound of rain on leaves and armor created a constant roar that made communication difficult. Visibility dropped to mere yards. And through that rain, Oda Nobunaga came with 3,000 men. Nobunaga was young, only 26 years old, and he was vastly outnumbered. His force was perhaps 1/8 the size of Yoshimoto's army. But he understood something fundamental about warfare that would define his career: the willingness to take shocking risks at precisely the right moment could overcome even overwhelming disadvantages. While Yoshimoto rested with the bulk of his army spread out along the route of march, Nobunaga struck directly at the headquarters with his elite troops, using the storm as cover, counting on surprise and concentrated force against a confused and dispersed enemy. The attack was devastating. In the chaos, Imagawa Yoshimoto himself was killed. The great lord, who had seemed poised to reshape Japan's future, died in the mud of an obscure gorge, struck down by soldiers who broke through his bodyguards in the confusion of the storm. His death was almost accidental in its swiftness, almost casual in the way it ended decades of careful planning and positioning. When news of Yoshimoto's death reached the scattered elements of his army, shock rippled through the ranks like the spreading of frost. For a few hours, no one quite believed it. Surely there was some mistake. Surely the great lord had not fallen. Surely their massive army had not been decapitated by a much smaller force. But as confirmation came from multiple sources, as officers saw the evidence with their own eyes, disbelief gave way to a more profound realization. Everything had changed. An army is a reflection of its commander's will. When that will is extinguished, the army becomes something else, a collection of individuals and units, each suddenly forced to make decisions based on their own circumstances, rather than following a unified purpose. Some elements of the Imagawa force tried to regroup, to continue the campaign, or at least to secure an orderly withdrawal. Others, recognizing that without Yoshimoto, the entire endeavor had lost its purpose, simply began the journey home to protect their own territories before rivals could take advantage of the chaos. Motoyasu received word of the disaster while still occupying the fortresses he had captured. The messenger who brought the news was exhausted, having ridden hard through dangerous territory, and the information he carried was fragmentary and frightening. Lord Yoshimoto was dead. The army was in confusion. Units were scattered. No clear orders were coming from anyone with authority to give them. For Motoyasu, at 18 years old, this was a moment of decision unlike any he had faced before. He could try to rejoin the surviving Imagawa forces, to help them withdraw and regroup, maintaining his loyalty to the clan that had been his overlord for most of his life. Or he could recognize that the world he had known for the past decade had just ended, and that new possibilities existed in the space that ending created. He consulted with his most trusted retainers, men who had served his father and who had waited years for an opportunity that might never come. The conversations were brief, conducted in low voices, amid the tension of forces that no longer knew who controlled what territory. And the decision, when it came, was presented not as a dramatic declaration, but as a practical assessment. They would withdraw to Okazaki Castle, Motoyasu's childhood home, which was now garrisoned by Imagawa forces. Once there, they would assess the situation and determine their next course of action. The march to Okazaki was tense. They moved through territory where the collapse of Imagawa authority created a vacuum, where other forces were also repositioning, where it was unclear who might be friend or foe. But they reached the castle without major incident, and when they arrived, Motoyasu's presence and calm authority convinced the garrison to accept his leadership. No dramatic siege was necessary. No violence occurred. The soldiers, confused and leaderless after Yoshimoto's death, simply transferred their allegiance to the Matsudaira lord whose family had once ruled this region. And just like that, Matsudaira Motoyasu regained his ancestral seat. The boy who had been taken from this castle 14 years earlier returned as a young man, no longer a hostage, but a daimyo in his own right, the ruler of a small but strategically important territory. It was a transformation achieved not through military conquest, but through the opportunity that sudden chaos creates, and through the willingness to act decisively in that moment of opportunity. But independence, once claimed, had to be defended. Motoyasu's domain was small, perhaps 200,000 koku in rice production. Modest compared to great lords, but sufficient to support a decent military force. More importantly, his territory lay between the Imagawa lands to the east and the Oda territories to the west. Both sides would have opinions about his newfound independence, and those opinions would likely be enforced with armies if he did not navigate carefully. The Imagawa, despite Yoshimoto's death, remained a powerful clan. Yoshimoto's son, Imagawa Ujizan, inherited the leadership, and while he lacked his father's ability, he still commanded substantial forces and certainly considered Motoyasu's actions to be either rebellion or betrayal. Messages arrived demanding that Motoyasu return to his proper status as an Imagawa vassal, restore the fortresses to Imagawa control, and submit to Ujizan's authority. Motoyasu responded with careful diplomatic language, acknowledging the Imagawa's historical position while not actually committing to anything. He needed time to consolidate his hold on his own territory, time to assess the shifting political landscape, time to determine which alliances would best serve his people's survival. To the west, Oda Nobunaga was in a very different position. His stunning victory at Okehazama had transformed him from a regional lord of modest importance into a figure who commanded attention across Japan. Young, ambitious, unconventional, and fearless, Nobunaga was beginning to assemble a new power base, and he understood that controlling Mikawa province would give him both security on his eastern border and a potential ally against the still formidable Imagawa. Nobunaga sent his own messages to Motoyasu, and these were quite different in tone. Rather than demands, they contained proposals. Rather than threats, they offered opportunities. Would Motoyasu consider an alliance? Would he recognize that the future lay not with the declining Imagawa, but with new powers rising to replace the old order? Would he see the advantage in joining forces with someone who had just demonstrated capability to achieve the impossible? For Motoyasu, the choice between Imagawa and Oda carried profound implications. Loyalty to the Imagawa meant security within a known framework. He would return to vassal status, but his position would be defined and relatively stable. Alliance with Oda meant greater risk, but also greater potential reward. He could maintain his independence, but he would be gambling on Nobunaga's continued success and making an enemy of the Imagawa in the process. He took his time deciding, but the decision, when it came, was clear-eyed and pragmatic. In 1561, he concluded a formal alliance with Oda Nobunaga. The agreement was structured as a pact between equals, not as vassalage, which allowed Motoyasu to maintain his independence while committing to mutual defense and cooperation. Symbolically, the alliance was sealed through various ceremonies and exchanges, creating bonds that both men took seriously. This alliance would prove to be one of the most consequential relationships in Japanese history. Nobunaga and Motoyasu, who would later take the name Tokugawa Ieyasu, were very different personalities. Nobunaga was bold, innovative, ruthless when necessary, willing to overturn tradition and adopt new methods if they promised advantage. He introduced large-scale use of firearms in Japanese warfare. He promoted men based on merit rather than birth. He showed little patience for rivals or delays. Motoyasu, by contrast, was cautious, traditional in his approach to leadership, patient to an almost legendary degree, and deeply concerned with maintaining loyalty and honor. Where Nobunaga might see a problem and immediately seek to destroy it, Motoyasu would study the problem, consider multiple approaches, and often wait for the situation to evolve until a clear solution presented itself. where Nobunaga inspired through the force of his personality and the brilliance of his strategies, Motoyasu earned loyalty through reliability and demonstrated care for his followers. Yet these differences were complementary rather than contradictory. Nobunaga needed an ally on his eastern border whom he could trust absolutely, someone who would not waver or betray him, no matter how tempting the alternatives might appear. Motoyasu needed an ally whose strength and dynamism would provide protection while he built up his own base of power. Each had something the other needed, and both were astute enough to recognize the value of the relationship. The immediate consequence of the alliance was war with the Imagawa. Ujizan could not accept Motoyasu's defection without response, both for strategic reasons and because allowing such a departure unpunished would encourage other vassals to consider their own independence. Throughout the early 1560s, Mikawa province became a battleground as Imagawa forces attempted to bring Motoyasu back into submission, and as Motoyasu, with Oda support, defended his territory and even began to expand into western portions of Imagawa-controlled lands. These were years of hard fighting. Motoyasu was frequently in the field, leading his forces in person, conducting sieges, defending fortifications, managing the constant demands of warfare. Victories came, but so did setbacks. Some of his retainers were killed in battle. Some territories changed hands multiple times as campaigns flowed back and forth. Resources were strained as military requirements competed with the need to maintain agricultural production and civil order. But through it all, Motoyasu demonstrated the qualities that would define his entire career. He was patient when others might have grown frustrated. He was methodical when others might have relied on dramatic gestures. He took care of his men, ensuring they were fed and equipped as well as his resources allowed, visiting the wounded, honoring the dead, maintaining the bonds between lord and retainer that were the foundation of samurai loyalty. He also learned from Nobunaga, though the learning was often by observation rather than direct instruction. He saw how Nobunaga organized his armies, how he used firearms effectively, how he managed sieges and field battles, how he handled victory and defeat, how he balanced mercy with ruthlessness. Not all of Nobunaga's methods suited Motoyasu's temperament, but the exposure to different approaches expanded his understanding of what was possible. By the mid-1560s, Motoyasu had firmly established his independence and significantly expanded his territory. Mikawa province was now largely under his control, and the Imagawa, weakened by their loss of prestige after Yoshimoto's death and by internal conflicts, could no longer seriously threaten him. He had survived the transition from hostage to independent lord, had honored his alliance with Oda Nobunaga without becoming subordinate to him, and had begun to build a reputation as a reliable, capable leader. In 1566, he took a significant step that marked his growing confidence and status. He changed his name from Matsudaira Motoyasu to Tokugawa Ieyasu. The Tokugawa name claimed descent from the Minamoto clan, the ancient warrior family that had produced Japan's first shogun centuries earlier. This was more than a personal choice. It was a statement of ambition, a declaration that he saw himself not merely as a local lord, but as part of Japan's historical nobility. someone with a legitimate claim to national leadership. The name Ieyasu would be the one by which history would remember him, though he was still decades away from the achievements that would make that name legendary. For now, he was simply one among many daimyo, notable for his alliance with the rising power of Oda Nobunaga, but not yet a central figure in the great drama of reunification that was beginning to unfold. But he was learning, always learning, adding to the accumulated wisdom that would one day prove decisive. And he was building his territory, building his military strength, building the network of loyal retainers who would serve him through every crisis to come, building the foundations of something that would outlast them all. The young man who had once been a hostage was becoming someone who others would come to rely upon. And the world of the Sengoku period, for all its chaos and conflict, was slowly beginning to shift toward a new order, though that shift was still barely visible beneath the surface of ongoing warfare. The 1570s and early 1580s were years of transformation across Japan. Oda Nobunaga, with Tokugawa Ieyasu as his steadfast eastern ally, was reshaping the political landscape with stunning speed. Campaign followed campaign, each one carefully planned, ruthlessly executed, and designed to advance Nobunaga's ultimate objective: the complete reunification of Japan under his authority. It was a vision ambitious almost beyond comprehension. The Sengoku period had lasted over a century. Entire generations had lived and died, knowing only warfare and fragmentation. Hundreds of daimyo controlled their own domains, and many of these lords commanded substantial military forces. To unite them all required not just military victories, but the systematic destruction of any power center that might rival central authority. It required sieges and field battles. It required political skill and strategic alliances. It required, above all, an unshakable will to continue no matter the obstacles. Nobunaga possessed that will. He also possessed an innovative mind that was willing to break with tradition when tradition proved inefficient. He equipped his armies with massive numbers of firearms and trained his troops to fire in coordinated volleys, creating devastating firepower that could shatter even determined enemy formations. He built powerful fortifications and enormous castles that served both as military strongpoints and as symbols of authority. He suppressed religious institutions that resisted his rule, sometimes with shocking brutality. He promoted trade and economic development, understanding that wealth generated power. And he demanded absolute loyalty from those who served him, offering great rewards to the faithful and terrible punishment to the treacherous. Throughout this period, Ieyasu remained Nobunaga's most reliable ally. Their partnership, forged in 1561, never wavered. When Nobunaga campaigned to the north, Ieyasu secured the eastern approaches. When enemies threatened from multiple directions, Ieyasu's forces protected key positions. When Nobunaga needed time to consolidate new conquests, Ieyasu's steady presence provided security. But the relationship was more than purely strategic. Despite their different temperaments, or perhaps because of them, the two men developed a bond of mutual respect and even affection. Nobunaga, who trusted few people completely, trusted Ieyasu. and Ieyasu, who chose his commitments carefully and honored them absolutely, was committed to Nobunaga's success. Ieyasu's own domain grew during these years. By the late 1570s, he controlled not only Mikawa, but also substantial portions of Totomi province, territories he had taken from the declining Imagawa. His military forces numbered in the tens of thousands. His administration was efficient and well organized. His vassals were loyal, bound to him by years of shared experience and his careful attention to their welfare. He was no longer a minor daimyo, but one of the more substantial powers in central Japan, though still clearly subordinate in prestige and reach to Nobunaga. One of the hardest campaigns during this period came in 1572 and 1573, when Takeda Shingen, the formidable lord of Kai province and one of the period's greatest generals, marched westward with a powerful army. Takeda's objective was nothing less than the destruction of the Oda-Tokugawa alliance and the seizure of Kyoto for himself. His army was veteran, superbly led, and feared throughout Japan. Ieyasu faced Takeda's forces at Mikatagahara in January 1573, and the result was a devastating defeat. Takeda's superior cavalry and veteran troops shattered Ieyasu's army, forcing him to flee back to his castle at Hamamatsu. Legend says that Ieyasu, in the aftermath of this defeat, had his portrait painted showing his face drawn with fear and exhaustion, and that he kept this portrait for the rest of his life as a reminder of the costs of overconfidence and the bitter taste of defeat. But Takeda's campaign, despite this victory, ultimately failed. Shingen fell ill during the campaign and died, and his army withdrew. Ieyasu survived, recovered, and learned from the experience. The defeat taught him valuable lessons about the importance of terrain, the dangers of engaging a superior force without adequate preparation, and the absolute necessity of maintaining reserve forces that could cover a withdrawal if things went badly. By the early 1580s, Nobunaga's vision seemed close to realization. He controlled or dominated vast territories stretching across central Japan. Potential rivals had been defeated or brought into alliance. The imperial court in Kyoto was under his influence. He was building Azuchi Castle on Lake Biwa, a magnificent structure unlike anything Japan had seen before. 7 stories high, with gold leaf decorating its upper floors, a symbol of power that could be seen for miles. Ieyasu visited Azuchi in 1582, part of a diplomatic tour to meet with Nobunaga and coordinate future plans. The meeting was cordial, warm even. The two men discussed campaigns yet to come, territories still to be pacified, the shape of the peace they would create once all resistance had been overcome. They shared meals, they discussed strategy and governance, and when Ieyasu departed, it was with a sense that the great work was nearly complete, that the decades of warfare might finally be approaching their end. But then, on the night of June 21st, 1582, everything shattered. Nobunaga was staying at Honno-ji, a temple in Kyoto, with only a small personal guard. He felt secure enough in the capital that large military escorts seemed unnecessary. One of his generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, was camped nearby with a substantial army, ostensibly preparing for a campaign. But Mitsuhide had turned traitor, for reasons that historians still debate. Some suggest personal grievances, Others point to political ambitions. Still others believe Mitsuhide saw Nobunaga's radical changes as threatening to the traditional order. Whatever his motivations, Mitsuhide surrounded Honno-ji in the darkness before dawn and attacked. Nobunaga, awakened by the sounds of battle, quickly realized the situation was hopeless. He was vastly outnumbered, cut off from his main forces, with no possibility of relief arriving in time. Rather than allow himself to be captured, he retreated to an inner chamber and committed seppuku, ritual suicide, ending his own life with dignity rather than dying at an enemy's hands. The temple was set ablaze, and in the fire, Nobunaga's body was consumed, leaving no remains for his enemies to desecrate. His eldest son and heir, Oda Nobutada, was at Nijo Castle in Kyoto. When news of the attack reached him, he tried to organize resistance, but he too was overwhelmed by Mitsuhide's forces. He also chose death over capture, falling in the fighting or by his own hand. The accounts differ. In a single morning, Nobunaga and his primary heir were both gone, and the structure of power that Nobunaga had built over 20 years suddenly stood without its architect. Ieyasu was in Sakai, a port city south of Kyoto, when news of the catastrophe arrived. He was in friendly territory, but also dangerously exposed, with only a small personal guard, and separated from his main army, which was back in his home provinces. Mitsuhide's forces controlled the routes between Sakai and home. The situation was perilous. If Mitsuhide learned of Ieyasu's location, he might well send forces to kill or capture him, eliminating a potential avenger and further consolidating his position. Ieyasu's retainers urged him to commit seppuku immediately, arguing that death with honor was preferable to the humiliation of capture or the danger of being hunted. It was what many expected in such circumstances, the traditional response to the death of one's lord. But Ieyasu, despite his shock and grief, thought differently. His death would serve no purpose except to add to the tragedy. His survival might allow him to eventually avenge Nobunaga and continue the work they had begun together. He decided to attempt the journey home. It was dangerous. They would have to move through hostile or uncertain territory, traveling fast and light, avoiding main roads where Mitsuhide's forces might intercept them. The route they chose took them through mountain passes and remote areas where the reach of armies was limited. It became known as the Iga Crossing, after the Iga province they passed through, a journey conducted in haste and fear, never knowing if the next turn in the path might reveal enemies. But they made it, through a combination of speed, luck, careful navigation, and the help of local guides who were paid or persuaded to assist them. Ieyasu and his small party reached his territories safely. Once there, he immediately began mobilizing his forces, preparing to march against Mitsuhide and avenge his fallen ally. But while Ieyasu was making his escape and preparing his response, another of Nobunaga's generals was already moving. Hashiba Hideyoshi, who was campaigning in western Japan when he received news of Nobunaga's death, immediately concluded a hasty peace with his current enemies and force-marched his army back toward Kyoto. He covered the distance with remarkable speed, reaching the capital region in just days, and on July 2nd, 1582, barely 2 weeks after Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi engaged Mitsuhide's forces at the Battle of Yamazaki. The battle was decisive. Mitsuhide's support proved shallow. Many daimyo who might have joined him chose to wait and see how events unfolded, and some who had initially pledged support changed their minds when they saw Hideyoshi's rapid response. Mitsuhide's forces were defeated, and he was killed while fleeing the battlefield, either by peasants who did not recognize him or by his own retainers to prevent his capture. Again, the accounts differ. By the time Ieyasu had mobilized and was ready to march, the immediate crisis was over. Mitsuhide was dead, his brief rebellion crushed. But the larger question remained: who would inherit Nobunaga's position? Who would lead the forces that Nobunaga had assembled? Who would complete the unification that Nobunaga had begun? Hideyoshi, by the swiftness of his action and the decisiveness of his victory, had placed himself at the center of that question. He had avenged Nobunaga. He had protected Nobunaga's young grandsons, who were potential heirs. He had demonstrated both military capability and political skill. And he began, carefully but clearly, to position himself as Nobunaga's true successor. Ieyasu, arriving after the battle was already decided, had to reassess the situation. His grief over Nobunaga's death was genuine. He had lost not just an ally, but a friend, someone he had worked beside for over 20 years. But grief could not guide policy. He needed to determine what Hideyoshi's intentions were, whether Hideyoshi could be trusted, whether Hideyoshi had the capability to complete Nobunaga's vision, and what role Ieyasu himself should play in whatever came next. The months following Nobunaga's death were tense and complex. Various generals and daimyo who had served Nobunaga jockeyed for position. Alliances were proposed and evaluated. Military forces were repositioned. Everyone was trying to determine whether the structure Nobunaga had built would hold together or fragment into renewed warfare. Hideyoshi, showing political skills that matched his military talents, worked to hold the coalition together. He did not immediately claim supreme authority, but rather presented himself as the loyal servant of Nobunaga's heirs, acting as regent for children too young to rule. He distributed territories and honors to key allies. He negotiated with potential rivals. He demonstrated that he intended to continue Nobunaga's policies and complete the unification. And gradually, over months and then years, he succeeded. Most of Nobunaga's former vassals and allies accepted Hideyoshi's leadership. Those who did not were defeated in a series of campaigns. By the mid-1580s, Hideyoshi had established himself as the paramount power in Japan, and the work of unification was continuing, now under his banner rather than Nobunaga's. Ieyasu watched all this carefully. He recognized Hideyoshi's skill and capability. He also recognized that direct confrontation with Hideyoshi would likely end badly. Hideyoshi commanded far greater resources and had the momentum of recent victories behind him. But accepting Hideyoshi's supremacy completely would mean surrendering the independence that Ieyasu had maintained even in his alliance with Nobunaga. The relationship between these two men, one who had been Nobunaga's most brilliant and successful general, the other who had been Nobunaga's most loyal and steadfast ally, would define Japanese history for the next 2 decades. They were both skilled, both ambitious, both capable of both cooperation and conflict. And the question of which path they would choose, cooperation or conflict, would determine whether Japan's unification would be completed through continued warfare or through negotiated accommodation. For now, in the immediate aftermath of Nobunaga's death, Ieyasu returned to his domains and focused on consolidating his position. The world had changed overnight, and he needed time to understand what the new reality would require of him. The man who had been patient all his life would need to be patient still, watching, assessing, and waiting for the right moment to act decisively. The great wheel of history had turned again, suddenly and violently, as it so often does. And those who wished to survive, let alone prosper, needed to adapt to the new landscape that the turning had created. The years between Nobunaga's death in 1582 and the decisive confrontation that would determine Japan's future were years of careful maneuvering, of alliances tested and relationships negotiated, of Ieyasu building his position piece by piece while never moving so aggressively as to provoke the overwhelming response that Hideyoshi could bring to bear. Ieyasu's territories in 1582 were substantial, Mikawa and Totomi provinces, plus portions of Suruga, giving him control over important agricultural lands and strategic locations. His military forces were well-trained and loyal. His administration was efficient. He had resources to defend himself and even to expand if opportunities arose. But compared to Hideyoshi's growing domain, which stretched across much of western and central Japan, Ieyasu's power was clearly secondary. In 1584, conflict did break out between them, though it came indirectly. Oda Nobukatsu, one of Nobunaga's surviving sons, resented Hideyoshi's growing dominance and sought to challenge it. He formed an alliance with Ieyasu, and together they confronted Hideyoshi's forces in what became known as the Komaki Nagakute campaign. The campaign was notable for several reasons. First, it demonstrated Ieyasu's defensive skill. He chose his positions well, fortified them thoroughly, and made it clear that any attempt to dislodge him would be costly. When battles did occur, his forces performed well, particularly at Nagakute, where they defeated one of Hideyoshi's armies decisively. But perhaps more importantly, the campaign demonstrated Ieyasu's political judgment. He recognized that while he could defend his territory, he could not defeat Hideyoshi outright. Eventually, he entered into negotiations. The settlement that emerged from these negotiations was remarkable for what it preserved. Ieyasu agreed to accept Hideyoshi's supremacy in certain respects, sending his own son as a hostage to Hideyoshi's court, a painful echo of his own childhood, and acknowledging Hideyoshi's national leadership. But he retained his independence in managing his own domains, and Hideyoshi, recognizing the value of having Ieyasu as an ally rather than a perpetual enemy, offered generous terms that respected Ieyasu's dignity and position. It was a compromise that suited both men. Hideyoshi gained Ieyasu's nominal submission without the enormous cost of trying to conquer him by force. Ieyasu secured his independence within a framework of formal submission, gaining security and the opportunity to continue building his power. The arrangement was similar to what Ieyasu had maintained with Nobunaga, a relationship of alliance rather than pure vassalage, though the balance of power was more tilted toward Hideyoshi than it had been toward Nobunaga. Over the next several years, their relationship evolved into something approaching genuine partnership, though always with the understanding that Hideyoshi held primacy. When Hideyoshi launched campaigns to subjugate remaining independent daimyo, Ieyasu participated, providing troops and commanders, demonstrating his value as an ally. When Hideyoshi conducted his massive invasions of Korea in the 1590s, ambitious and ultimately futile attempts to conquer the peninsula and potentially China beyond it, Ieyasu contributed forces, though he was careful not to commit his best troops or generals to campaigns that seemed to him strategically questionable. In 1590, Hideyoshi completed the unification of Japan by forcing the submission of the Hojo clan in the Kanto region, the last major power that had remained independent. It was a massive campaign involving sieges and overwhelming force, and when it ended, Hideyoshi controlled all of Japan, either directly or through loyal vassals. The Sengoku period, after more than a century, was finally over. As a reward for Ieyasu's participation in the campaign, and perhaps also to remove him from his established power base in central Japan, Hideyoshi offered Ieyasu the Hojo territories in the Kanto, the 8 provinces surrounding Edo, the future Tokyo. On paper, it was a generous grant. The territories were extensive, theoretically capable of producing 800,000 koku of rice, more than Ieyasu currently controlled. But there were complications. The region was underdeveloped compared to central Japan. It had been fought over during the recent campaign, leaving damage and resentment. And most importantly, accepting the transfer meant leaving behind Mikawa, the ancestral Tokugawa homeland, and the network of castles and retainers that Ieyasu had built over decades. Ieyasu accepted. It was a momentous decision, one that shaped the future in ways neither he nor Hideyoshi could fully anticipate. Some historians suggest Hideyoshi intended the transfer as a way to weaken Ieyasu by separating him from his established base. Others argue Hideyoshi genuinely wanted to reward his most powerful vassal with territories worthy of his status. Perhaps both motivations coexisted. Whatever Hideyoshi's intent, Ieyasu made the Kanto his own. He established his headquarters at Edo, then a relatively small castle town, and set about transforming the region. He drained swamps to create new agricultural land. He rebuilt and expanded Edo Castle. He improved roads and encouraged trade. He invited merchants and artisans to settle in Edo, offering incentives and protections. He reorganized the administration of the 8 provinces, placing his most trusted retainers in key positions. The transformation took years, but Ieyasu approached it with his characteristic patience and thoroughness. Gradually, Edo grew from a modest town into a thriving city. The Kanto became prosperous, its rice production actually exceeding the nominal assessment. And Ieyasu, far from being weakened by the transfer, found himself controlling a power base larger and potentially more valuable than what he had left behind, though it took time for that potential to be realized. During these years in the Kanto, Ieyasu also focused on cultivating the next generation of leadership. His sons and key retainers' sons were trained not just in martial arts, but in administration, strategy, and the complex skills that governance required. He established schools and invited scholars to Edo. He built temples and shrines. He created the infrastructure, physical, administrative, and cultural, that a major domain required. He also developed his political philosophy, influenced by Confucian thought and by his own decades of experience. He valued order, hierarchy, loyalty, and stability. He believed that a lord's primary duty was to protect and provide for his people, and that, in return, those people owed loyalty and diligent work. He thought that harsh punishments should be rare but certain when necessary, that rewards should be proportionate to service, and that consistency and predictability in governance were more valuable than brilliance or innovation. These principles guided how he ruled the Kanto, and they would later guide how he ruled all Japan. They were not particularly original principles. Many were drawn from centuries of Confucian thought and Japanese tradition. But Ieyasu applied them consistently and thoroughly, creating administrative systems that were both effective and sustainable. His relationship with Hideyoshi during these years remained cordial but complex. They corresponded regularly, exchanged gifts, visited each other's courts. Ieyasu attended important ceremonies and participated in Hideyoshi's councils when summoned. But there was always a careful distance maintained, a recognition that while they were allies, they were also the two most powerful men in Japan, and neither entirely trusted the other. Hideyoshi, as he grew older, became increasingly concerned with his legacy and the succession. He had produced a son, Toyotomi Hideyori, late in life, and he wanted to ensure that Hideyori would inherit his position. To this end, Hideyoshi created the Council of 5 Elders, 5 powerful daimyo, including Ieyasu, who were meant to collectively govern Japan and protect Hideyori's interests until the boy came of age. In 1598, Hideyoshi's health declined rapidly. He was in his early 60s, not extremely old by modern standards, but aged for that era, and the burdens of his position and the strain of the Korean campaigns had worn him down. As he lay dying, he called the 5 elders to him, and made them swear oaths to protect Hideyori and maintain the system he had built. Ieyasu swore the oath, and there is no reason to believe he did not mean it at the time. He had no particular animosity toward a child Hideyori. He had worked loyally for Hideyoshi for nearly 15 years. The system Hideyoshi had created offered stability, which Ieyasu valued deeply. If the Council of 5 Elders could govern effectively and maintain unity, Japan's long peace could continue. But oaths, no matter how sincerely sworn, cannot change fundamental political realities. Hideyoshi had unified Japan through his personal authority, his military genius, and his political skill. With him gone, the glue that held everything together began to weaken. The 5 elders had pledged to work cooperatively, but they were themselves powerful lords with their own interests, their own ambitions, their own views on how Japan should be governed. And Ieyasu, whether he sought it or not, was the most powerful among them. His territories in the Kanto were vast and well governed. His military forces were the largest and best trained. His reputation for competence and reliability was unmatched. Other daimyo looked to him for leadership, and gradually, almost inevitably, power began to flow in his direction. This created tensions with other members of the council, particularly Ishida Mitsunari, who had been one of Hideyoshi's closest civilian administrators. Mitsunari was intelligent, capable, and utterly devoted to Hideyoshi's memory and to protecting Hideyori's inheritance. He viewed Ieyasu's growing influence with alarm, seeing in it a threat to everything Hideyoshi had built. And Mitsunari was not alone. Several other powerful lords shared his concerns and his loyalty to the Toyotomi house. The years 1598 and 1599 saw these tensions rise steadily. Disagreements arose over policy. Alliances formed and reformed. Accusations were made, carefully worded, but sharp nonetheless. Ieyasu moved cautiously, making no overtly aggressive moves, but also not yielding his position or his prerogatives. He cultivated relationships with other daimyo, offering assistance, building networks of obligation and friendship. By 1600, the situation had become unsustainable. Japan had two power centers, Ieyasu in the east, commanding the loyalty of many daimyo, and Mitsunari in the west, claiming to speak for the Toyotomi house and rallying those who opposed Ieyasu's ascendancy. Both sides prepared for conflict, while publicly claiming to seek only stability and unity. Messages were exchanged, alliances were confirmed, armies were mobilized and positioned. The question was no longer whether there would be a confrontation, but when and where it would occur. After 18 years of peace, the specter of large-scale warfare returned to Japan. The irony was bitter. Hideyoshi had ended the Sengoku period, but his death had created conditions that threatened to restart it. Ieyasu, now 58 years old, had spent nearly his entire life navigating through wars and political crises. He had survived hostage-ship, had fought in dozens of campaigns, had lost his closest allies to sudden death, had built and rebuilt his power base, had outlived most of his generation. And now he faced perhaps the most important decision of his life, whether to accept a subordinate position under a system led by others in Hideyori's name, or to claim supremacy for himself. He had always been patient. He had always been cautious. He had always preferred negotiation to confrontation when both were possible. But he also understood power, and he understood that this moment would define Japan's future for generations. The decision, when it came, would not be made lightly. But it would be made, and when it was, there would be no turning back. The stage was set, the armies were gathering, and the autumn of 1600 would see a battle that would determine who would rule Japan and how that rule would be exercised for the next 2.5 centuries. To understand how Japan reached the threshold of Sekigahara, we must step back briefly to examine more fully the relationship between Ieyasu and Hideyoshi, and how their partnership, despite its tensions, represented the culmination of decades of unification efforts. When Hideyoshi emerged as Nobunaga's successor after 1582, he brought to power a perspective quite different from his predecessors. Nobunaga had been a revolutionary, willing to destroy tradition and remake society according to his vision. Hideyoshi, by contrast, was more conservative in certain ways, more interested in working within existing structures even as he adapted them to his purposes. Hideyoshi was born a peasant, which was itself remarkable in an age where birth determined almost everything. He rose through merit and opportunity, beginning as a foot soldier and ascending through clever service and demonstrated capability until he became one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals. His low birth meant he could not claim certain traditional positions. He would never be shogun, a title reserved for those of proper lineage, but it also gave him a certain flexibility. He was not bound by the same obligations and expectations that constrained those born into the samurai class. Ieyasu represented something quite different. His lineage was ancient and impeccable, his claim to belong among the highest ranks of the samurai class unquestionable. He had been born to rule, trained for it from childhood, and he embodied the traditional values of the warrior aristocracy in ways that Hideyoshi, for all his accomplishments, couldn't. Yet these differences became complementary within their relationship. Hideyoshi needed the legitimacy and stability that Ieyasu's support provided. Having the most prominent daimyo of unquestionable lineage allied with him strengthened Hideyoshi's position immeasurably. Conversely, Ieyasu benefited from Hideyoshi's dynamic energy and the protection that Hideyoshi's overwhelming power offered. Together, they formed a partnership that was stronger than either could have been alone. After the settlement of their conflict in 1584, they worked together with increasing effectiveness. When Hideyoshi moved to subjugate Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, in 1587, Ieyasu provided substantial forces and logistical support. When Hideyoshi faced the powerful Hojo clan in 1590, Ieyasu was there with his armies, participating in the siege of Odawara Castle that finally brought the Kanto under Hideyoshi's authority. But their partnership extended beyond military campaigns. Hideyoshi valued Ieyasu's counsel on matters of governance and administration. While Hideyoshi had brilliant political instincts, he sometimes moved too quickly, relying on his ability to improvise and adjust. Ieyasu provided a steadying influence, asking careful questions, pointing out potential complications, suggesting alternatives that might achieve the same objectives with less risk. Hideyoshi implemented a series of reforms that would reshape Japanese society, and that Ieyasu generally supported, even if he sometimes had reservations about specific implementations. The land surveys, which Hideyoshi ordered conducted throughout Japan, established clear records of agricultural production and provided the basis for rational tax collection. The measures restricting samurai to carrying weapons and defining more sharply the distinction between warrior and commoner classes helped reduce the instability that had characterized the Sengoku period. The policies regulating trade and encouraging economic development created prosperity that benefited both lords and common people. Not all of Hideyoshi's decisions were wise. The Korean invasions, which began in 1592 and continued intermittently until Hideyoshi's death in 1598, consumed enormous resources and achieved nothing lasting. Ieyasu participated minimally, sending forces as obligations required, but keeping his best troops and generals at home. He understood, as apparently Hideyoshi did not, that the campaigns were overextended and ultimately futile. Korea was not going to be conquered by Japanese forces, no matter how determined, and beyond Korea lay China, a realm far larger and more powerful than Japan. The whole enterprise was built on fantastical assumptions about what was possible. But Ieyasu did not publicly oppose the campaigns. To do so would have broken the alliance and risked everything he had built. Instead, he quietly minimized his involvement while maintaining public support, a delicate balance that required careful management. Some historians argue this showed Ieyasu's political cowardice, that a truly loyal vassal would have offered frank counsel even if unwelcome. Others suggest it showed his wisdom, recognizing that some lessons can only be learned through experience, and that maintaining the alliance was more important than winning an unwinnable argument. Throughout these years, Ieyasu was also managing the complex internal politics of his own domain. His retainers included men who had served his father, men who had joined him during his rise, and newer followers attracted by his growing power. Each group had its own perspective and its own interests. Balancing these competing voices, rewarding loyalty while also promoting competence, maintaining discipline while also encouraging initiative, all this required constant attention. He also faced family challenges. His wife, Lady Tsukiyama, had been accused of treasonous correspondence with the Takeda clan back in 1579, and under pressure from Nobunaga, Ieyasu had ordered her death, though the full circumstances remain murky and disputed. His eldest son, Nobuyasu, had also died in 1579, forced to commit suicide over allegations that remain controversial. Some sources suggest Nobuyasu had indeed engaged in questionable conduct. Others hint that he was victim of political machinations. These tragedies haunted Ieyasu, and they shaped his relationship with his surviving sons. His heir was Hidetada, born in 1579, the same year that marked the family tragedies. Hidetada was raised carefully, educated thoroughly, and gradually given increasing responsibilities. Ieyasu was determined that his son would be prepared for leadership, that the mistakes and misfortunes of the past would not be repeated. The relationship between father and son was formal, as was customary in that culture, but there is evidence of genuine affection beneath the formality. As the 1590s progressed and Hideyoshi aged, Ieyasu increasingly found himself thinking about the future beyond Hideyoshi. He did not plot against Hideyoshi. Their alliance remained firm, but he would have been foolish not to consider what would happen when Hideyoshi died. The Toyotomi heir, Hideyori, was a child. Collective governance through the Council of 5 Elders might work, or it might fragment into competing power centers. Much would depend on personalities, on unforeseen circumstances, on whether the other elders would cooperate or compete. Ieyasu prepared for multiple possibilities. He strengthened his base in the Kanto, making it ever more formidable. He cultivated relationships across the entire spectrum of daimyo, offering assistance where he could, building networks of goodwill and obligation. He attended meticulously to his military forces, ensuring they remained well-trained and well-equipped. He managed his finances carefully, building reserves that could support extended campaigns if necessary. And he waited, patient as always, for events to reveal what path he should take. When Hideyoshi finally died in September 1598, Ieyasu mourned sincerely. Whatever their differences, whatever careful calculations had underlain their relationship, There had also been genuine respect and even friendship. They had worked together for nearly 15 years. They had helped each other through crises. They had built something together. And now that partnership was ending. But mourning could not last long. The practicalities of succession demanded immediate attention. Hideyori was only 6 years old. The Council of 5 Elders was meant to govern collectively until he came of age. But collective governance required consensus, and consensus was proving elusive. The elders did not all share the same vision for Japan's future. Some prioritized maintaining the specific institutions Hideyoshi had created. Others believed those institutions needed adaptation. And Ieyasu, whether by design or simply by being who he was, found power flowing toward him in ways that alarmed those committed to preserving Toyotomi supremacy. Ishida Mitsunari, in particular, watched Ieyasu's growing influence with increasing concern. Mitsunari had served Hideyoshi faithfully as an administrator and had been deeply involved in implementing Hideyoshi's policies. He was clever, diligent, and utterly devoted to Hideyoshi's legacy. But he was not popular among the warrior lords, who sometimes resented his influence and his civilian background, and he lacked the military resources that would be needed if disputes escalated beyond politics into warfare. Through 1599, tensions rose. Ieyasu arranged marriages between his family and other powerful daimyo families, strengthening alliances in ways that some saw as preparation for eventual supremacy. Mitsunari and his allies accused Ieyasu of violating the spirit of the collective governance arrangement. Ieyasu responded that he was simply managing his domain's affairs and maintaining appropriate relationships, nothing more. The rhetoric grew sharper. Trust eroded. Small incidents took on larger significance. By early 1600, Japan was effectively divided into 2 camps. The Eastern Army, led by Ieyasu, consisted of daimyo who either trusted his leadership or calculated that their interests lay with him. The Western Army, assembled by Mitsunari, included those loyal to the Toyotomi house and those who saw Ieyasu as a threat to the settlement Hideyoshi had created. Neither side wanted war. War meant death, destruction, the waste of resources, and uncertain outcomes. But neither side would yield its position. During the summer of 1600, Ieyasu moved his forces westward, ostensibly to deal with some unrelated matter, but actually positioning himself strategically. Mitsunari responded by seizing Osaka Castle, where young Hideyori resided, claiming authority in the boy's name. Other daimyo across Japan had to decide which side to support or whether to try to remain neutral and wait to see which side prevailed. It was a situation of enormous complexity, with dozens of major lords, each making their own calculations, each trying to determine where their best interests lay. Some chose based on personal loyalty to individuals they had served under. Some chose based on careful assessment of which side seemed likely to win. Some chose based on ancient grudges or recent slights, settling scores that had little to do with the nominal issues dividing the camps. And some tried to hedge, promising support to one side while secretly negotiating with the other, hoping to end up on the winning side regardless of outcome. Through all this maneuvering, Ieyasu remained relatively calm, at least outwardly. He had faced crises before. He understood that panic and haste led to mistakes, He gave his orders clearly, moved his forces deliberately, and waited for his opponents to reveal their intentions fully. He knew that Mitsunari, for all his intelligence, lacked experience in large-scale military operations. He knew that the Western Army, despite its impressive roster of daimyo, had coordination problems and conflicting interests among its members. But he also knew that battle was inherently unpredictable. Careful planning could increase the probability of victory, but it could not guarantee it. Weather, terrain, the performance of individual units, unexpected decisions by key commanders, pure chance, all these could tip the balance. If he lost the coming battle, his life would likely end, his family would be destroyed, and his life's work would be undone. The stakes could not be higher. And so, as autumn approached and the armies converged on a plain in central Japan called Sekigahara, Ieyasu prepared himself for what might be his final test. He was 58 years old, an age when many men were preparing for retirement. But there would be no retirement for him, no quiet withdrawal to a monastery or a country estate. His path led forward through one more battle, toward a future that remained to be determined. The morning mist lay thick over the valley in early October 1600. Autumn had come to central Japan, painting the mountain slopes with reds and golds, bringing cooler air that carried the scent of harvested rice fields and distant wood smoke. It was the season of gathering, of preparation for winter, of securing what had been grown through summer's labor. But this autumn would not see peaceful harvest celebrations in the region around Sekigahara. Instead, it would witness armies converging from east and west, more than 150,000 men moving toward a confrontation that would determine Japan's future. The plain of Sekigahara lay in a valley surrounded by low mountains, crossed by the Nakasendo Road that connected the eastern and western regions of Japan. It was strategic ground, a place where armies moving between domains would naturally converge. The valley was perhaps 2 miles long and a mile wide, with slopes rising on the northern and southern sides and mountains closing off the eastern and western ends. Rice fields covered much of the valley floor, their harvest recently completed, leaving stubble and mud. Small villages dotted the area, their inhabitants watching with growing dread as military forces gathered around them. Ieyasu's eastern army approached from the east, moving along the Nakasendo Road in good order. His forces numbered approximately 80,000 men, samurai warriors, ashigaru foot soldiers, arquebusiers with their matchlock rifles, cavalry units, supply trains stretching for miles. The army moved with the discipline of veteran troops led by experienced commanders. Ieyasu himself rode near the center of the column, surrounded by his personal guard and his most trusted generals, his presence marked by the Tokugawa banners that flew above the marching host. He had chosen his commanders carefully. Honda Tadakatsu, now in his early 50s and one of Japan's most respected generals, commanded a major division. Inaomasa, young but brilliantly capable, led the vanguard. Other divisions were entrusted to lords who had proven their loyalty and competence through years of service. Ieyasu's own son, Hidetada, was supposed to be bringing an additional force from the Kanto. Though he had been delayed dealing with resistance at Ueda Castle and would not arrive in time for the battle, a failure that would strain their relationship for years. The Western Army had assembled its forces around the valley, occupying positions on the surrounding heights. Ishida Mitsunari, as the political leader of the coalition, was present with his own forces, but the military command was more distributed. Several powerful daimyo had brought substantial armies. Ukita Hide, Konishi Yukinaga, Shima Sakon, and others, each commanding thousands of men, each positioned according to the overall battle plan. Critically, several major lords had positioned their forces in ways that seemed to support the Western Army, but whose actual loyalties remained uncertain. Kobayakawa Hideaki held Matsuo Mountain, overlooking the southern side of the valley, with 15,000 men. Wakizaka Yasuharu, Ogawa Suketada, Akaza Naoyasu, and Kutsuki Mototsuna held other key positions. These men had pledged support to Mitsunari, but Ieyasu's agents had been working on them, suggesting that rewards might flow more generously from the Eastern Army, hinting that backing Mitsunari might prove an unfortunate choice if the Western cause failed. Ieyasu understood that the battle's outcome might depend less on the initial deployments than on which side these uncertain commanders ultimately supported. Loyalty in the Sengoku period had always been conditional, based on complex calculations of obligation, self-interest, and assessment of probable outcomes. Men who had sworn to support one side might change that support if circumstances suggested they had chosen badly. It was not considered particularly dishonorable. Survival and the welfare of one's house took precedence over abstract principle, and a wise lord understood this. On October 20th, the two armies found themselves positioned for battle. The eastern forces were arrayed across the valley floor, their backs toward the mountains to the east. The western forces held the heights to north and south, with substantial contingents positioned to strike at the Eastern Army from multiple directions. On paper, the Western Army had advantages, better positions, nearly equal numbers, and the ability to coordinate attacks from the heights that would force the Eastern Army to fight uphill. But Ieyasu had several advantages of his own. His troops were better coordinated, having fought together in previous campaigns. His logistics were more reliable. His supply lines were shorter and more secure. His commanders were more experienced in large-scale battles. And critically, he had planted doubt in the minds of several Western commanders, making them question whether they should fully commit to the fight. The evening before the battle, Ieyasu met with his senior commanders in his field headquarters. Lanterns cast warm light on maps spread across low tables. The discussion was calm, methodical, reviewing the dispositions of forces, considering contingencies, ensuring everyone understood their roles. There was no bombast, no dramatic speeches about honor or destiny. These were professionals discussing their craft, and Ieyasu's questions were practical. Did they have enough ammunition? Were the supply wagons positioned correctly? Did each division commander know which forces they would be facing? Were there provisions for wounded to be evacuated from the field? Afterward, Ieyasu spent some time alone, as was his habit before major events. He did not pray dramatically or indulge in visible anxiety. Instead, he sat quietly, composed his thoughts, and prepared himself mentally for what dawn would bring. At 58, he had lived through so much: hostageship, warfare, defeat, victory, alliance, betrayal, the deaths of those he loved, the triumph of seeing his house rise from modest provincial lords to commanding the largest military force in Japan. Tomorrow would test whether that rise would continue or end in the mud of Sekigahara. Across the valley, in the western camp, the mood was different. Mitsunari was brilliant as an administrator, but less experienced in military command, and he was managing a coalition of strong-willed daimyo who had their own opinions about how the battle should be conducted. Some wanted to attack immediately, using their superior positions to press the Eastern Army before it could fully deploy. Others counseled caution, suggesting they wait for Ieyasu to attack uphill and exhaust his forces in the attempt. Still others, perhaps already reconsidering their commitment, argued for negotiation, suggesting that one more attempt to reach a political settlement might avoid the enormous risks of battle. In the end, they decided to wait for Ieyasu to make the first move, to let him attack their positions and break his army against their defenses. It seemed the safe choice, the conservative military decision. But it also meant surrendering initiative to an opponent who knew how to use it. That night, October 20th, 1600, was cool and clear. Campfires dotted the valley and hillsides like stars reflected on earth. Men checked their equipment, sharpened blades, cleaned firearms, wrote brief letters to families they might not see again. Some prayed at portable shrines or recited sutras with traveling monks who accompanied the armies. Others simply sat quietly, thinking private thoughts, preparing themselves for what might be their last dawn. Commanders made final rounds, speaking briefly with their troops, offering quiet words of encouragement, checking on morale. The samurai, particularly, prepared themselves according to their traditions. Some meditated on death, accepting that tomorrow they might fall, finding peace in that acceptance. Others focused on duty, on the specific tasks they would perform, on serving their lord and their comrades regardless of outcome. And a few, certainly, felt fear and struggled with it, trying to master their anxiety before the morning revealed whether their courage would hold. Ieyasu slept for a few hours, as he always did before battles. He had learned long ago that exhaustion led to poor judgment, and that a commander needed to be sharp when decisions had to be made quickly. He trusted his subordinates to handle the preparations, trusted his own experience to guide him through whatever developed, and trusted that he had done everything possible to position his forces for success. The rest was beyond his control, and he did not waste energy worrying about what he could not influence. Just after midnight, fog began rolling into the valley, thick banks of it flowing down from the mountains, reducing visibility to a few yards in some places. By 2 a.m., the entire valley was shrouded, a white blanket that muffled sound and made the campfires visible only as dim glows in the mist. It was the kind of fog that comes in autumn in central Japan, created when cool air meets warmer ground, and it would last until the sun rose high enough to burn it away. The fog changed calculations slightly. It would make the initial deployments more difficult, as units would have trouble maintaining alignment with each other. It would reduce the effectiveness of arquebusiers, whose gunpowder weapons needed clear lines of sight. But it might also provide cover for movements that would otherwise be visible to the enemy. Both sides would have to adapt. Around 4 a.m., Ieyasu woke and began his morning routine. Brief meditation, simple food, putting on his armor with the help of his attendants. His armor was magnificent, befitting his status, lacquered in black and gold, but it was also practical, designed to protect while allowing movement. He checked his weapons, katana and wakizashi, the long and short swords that every samurai carried, and his war fan, which he would use to signal orders during the battle. As dawn approached on October 21st, 1600, more than 150,000 men stirred, prepared, and moved into their positions. The largest battle of the Sengoku period, and one of the largest battles in Japanese history, was about to begin. And though none of them knew it yet, the next 6 hours would determine the course of Japan's development for the next 250 years. The fog still hung heavy as the eastern sky began to lighten. Men could hear each other, voices calling orders, the clink of armor and weapons, the movement of thousands of feet on wet ground, but could see only shapes and shadows in the grey morning light filtering through the mist. Somewhere, a war drum began beating, a deep rhythmic pulse that would continue throughout the coming battle, marking time like a giant heartbeat. And then, as the sun rose higher and the fog began to thin, the armies could finally see each other across the valley. Banners emerged from the mist, the Tokugawa hollyhock crest, the various symbols of the Western lords, countless smaller flags marking individual units. The valley was filled with men, tens of thousands of them, arrayed for war, waiting for the signal that would unleash chaos. Ieyasu, mounted on horseback, looked across the valley at the forces arrayed against him. His face showed no emotion, just the same calm attention he brought to all things. He raised his war fan, held it steady for a moment, then brought it down in a sharp, decisive motion. The signal was given. The Battle of Sekigahara had begun. The morning light broke softly through the lifting mist as the armies of the Eastern and Western coalitions faced each other across the valley of Sekigahara. What would unfold over the next 6 hours would be told not through the blood and violence of combat, for this is a story meant for peaceful rest, but through the movements of men and the decisions of commanders, through the flow of formations across terrain and the quiet drama of loyalties tested and choices made. Inaomasa, commanding the vanguard of Ieyasu's forces, led his Red Devils forward first. They were called this because of their distinctive crimson armor, and they were among the finest troops in Japan. Their advance across the valley floor was steady and disciplined, arquebusiers in front, spearmen behind, cavalry on the flanks. The Western forces on the slopes watched their approach, waiting for them to come into range. The first exchanges came as Inaomasa's forces engaged with the troops of Ukita Hide, who held positions on the northern side of the valley. Both sides deployed arquebusiers, and the crack of gunfire began to echo off the surrounding mountains. Sharp reports that came in waves as ranks fired, then fell back to reload while the next rank stepped forward. Smoke from the black powder weapons began to mix with the remaining morning mist, creating a grey haze that hung over the battlefield. The engagement was intense but methodical. Neither side was seeking a decisive breakthrough at this point. Rather, they were testing each other, probing for weaknesses, assessing the quality of their opponents. Casualties mounted on both sides. Men fell, were carried to the rear by their comrades, and the battle continued. This was the grim arithmetic of warfare in that age. Positions were held or lost based on which side could sustain losses longer while maintaining discipline. Honda Tadakatsu led his forces forward on the eastern flank, engaging with western troops commanded by Konishi Yukinaga. Tadakatsu was now in his 50s, a veteran of countless battles, and his reputation was such that his presence alone steadied his troops and concerned his enemies. His forces pressed forward methodically, using their superior training and coordination to gain ground slowly but steadily. All across the valley, similar engagements unfolded. Thousands of men moved forward and back, gained ground and lost it, fought with determination on both sides. The sound was overwhelming. Gunfire, the clash of weapons, war drums beating rhythmically, conch shells blown to signal orders, commanders shouting, wounded men calling for aid. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of disturbed earth and the metallic tang of steel. Ieyasu himself remained at his command position, elevated slightly so he could observe the battle's development. He was surrounded by messengers, ready to carry his orders to division commanders and by senior advisors who could help him interpret what was happening across the chaotic field. His son Hidetada was supposed to have arrived with reinforcements, but there was still no sign of him, which meant Ieyasu was fighting with fewer troops than he had hoped. This was concerning, but not devastating. His forces were still substantial and well led. The critical question, however, was what Kobayakawa Hideaki would do. Kobayakawa held Matsuo Mountain on the southern side of the valley with 15,000 men. If he committed those forces to the Western Army, attacking Ieyasu's flank, the Eastern Army would be in serious trouble, forced to fight on multiple fronts against superior numbers. But if Kobayakawa could be persuaded to switch sides, or simply to remain neutral, the Western Army's numerical advantage would be significantly reduced. Ieyasu had sent secret messages to Kobayakawa before the battle, promising rewards and honors if he would support the Eastern cause. Kobayakawa had not responded definitively, which left his intentions uncertain. As the morning wore on and Kobayakawa's forces remained stationary on Matsuo Mountain, neither attacking nor withdrawing, the tension of not knowing what he would do became almost unbearable for both sides. Ishida Mitsunari, from his own command position, also watched Kobayakawa's forces anxiously. He sent messengers urging Kobayakawa to attack, reminding him of his pledges, appealing to his honor. But Kobayakawa did not move. His troops remained in position, watching the battle unfold below them, their commander apparently unable or unwilling to commit to either side. Around mid-morning, Ieyasu made a decision. He ordered his arquebusiers to fire several volleys toward Kobayakawa's position on Matsuo Mountain. This was not a serious attack. The range was too great for the shots to be particularly effective. But it was a message. It was Ieyasu essentially saying, "Make your choice. Commit to one side or the other, but do not think you can sit this out and join the winner afterward. If you will not support us, we will treat you as an enemy." The psychological impact of these volleys was profound. Kobayakawa, watching gunfire directed at his position, had to decide immediately. He could either hold his ground and become the target of sustained attack, commit to the Western Army, and face Ieyasu's wrath if the Eastern Army won, or switch sides and join the Eastern cause. After what must have been agonizing deliberation, he made his choice. Kobayakawa's forces began to move down from Matsuo Mountain. For a few moments, it was unclear which army they were going to join, and then they turned and attacked the Western Army's flank, crashing into the forces of Otani Yoshitsugu, who had positioned his troops near the base of the mountain. Otani Yoshitsugu was one of the few truly tragic figures of Sekigahara. He was a brilliant commander and a deeply loyal friend to Ishida Mitsunari. He had actually advised Mitsunari that starting this war was a mistake, that Ieyasu was too strong and the Western coalition too divided to succeed. But when Mitsunari had insisted on fighting, Otani had remained loyal to his friend, bringing his forces to fight for a cause he believed was doomed. And now, betrayed by Kobayakawa, whose loyalty Mitsunari had trusted, Otani faced a hopeless situation. Rather than flee or surrender, Otani chose to fight. His forces engaged Kobayakawa's men in desperate combat, trying to hold the flank despite being outnumbered and surprised. The fighting in this sector became extraordinarily intense, with Otani's troops demonstrating remarkable courage and discipline even as their situation became increasingly untenable. When it became clear that his position could not be held, Otani made a final decision. Rather than face capture or die by enemy hands, he committed seppuku, ritual suicide, ending his own life with dignity according to the samurai code. His death was noted by both sides as an example of loyalty and honor maintained even in defeat, a reminder that even in warfare's chaos, individual choices of character and principle could still shine through. Kobayakawa's defection triggered a cascade effect. Other Western commanders who had been wavering, watching to see which way events would turn, now made their own decisions. Several more divisions switched sides or withdrew from the battle entirely, declining to continue fighting for what now appeared to be a losing cause. The Western Army, which had begun the day with numerical parity or perhaps a slight advantage, suddenly found itself outnumbered and outflanked. Ishida Mitsunari watched his coalition collapse with growing desperation. He sent urgent messages to various commanders, pleading for them to hold their positions, promising that reinforcements were coming, that victory was still possible. But the momentum had shifted decisively. The Eastern Army pressed forward with renewed confidence, while the Western Army's formations began to fragment. By early afternoon, the battle had effectively been decided, though fighting continued in several sectors. Some Western commanders conducted orderly withdrawals, pulling their forces back while maintaining discipline, avoiding complete disaster even in defeat. Others found their lines of retreat cut off and had to fight their way through Eastern forces to escape. And some chose to hold their ground and fight to the end, either from loyalty or because retreat was impossible. Konishi Yukinaga, a Christian daimyo who had fought bravely all morning, eventually had to withdraw his forces. Ukita Hideye also pulled back after sustaining heavy casualties. Shimazu Yoshihiro, whose forces had barely engaged in the main battle, conducted one of history's famous retreats, fighting his way directly through the Eastern Army's center to escape, demonstrating extraordinary courage and skill even in withdrawal. As the sun passed its zenith and began its afternoon descent, the valley of Sekigahara was transformed. What had been neat rice fields that morning were now churned mud, trampled by thousands of feet and horses. Equipment was scattered across the battlefield: broken spears, discarded flags, spent ammunition. The wounded were being gathered and carried to aid stations on both sides, where doctors and monks did what they could with the limited medical knowledge of the era. And in too many places, the still forms of those who had fallen lay where they had dropped. Ieyasu, from his command position, watched the Western army dissolve. There was no jubilation in his demeanor, no triumphant gestures. He had won, but victory in war always came at a cost, and he was too experienced not to understand that cost. Men who had served loyally were dead. Families had lost fathers and sons. The wounded would carry their injuries for life, and even among the victors there would be grief and loss. As evening approached, the battle wound down. Stragglers from both armies were making their way off the field. Commanders were accounting for their troops, determining casualties, securing prisoners. The practical work of dealing with battle's aftermath was beginning. Wounded to be treated, dead to be collected and honored, equipment to be salvaged, reports to be written. Ishida Mitsunari escaped the battlefield but was captured a few days later. He was treated with respect, as a defeated enemy should be, according to samurai custom. But his fate was sealed. He had led a rebellion against what was now clearly the legitimate authority. He would be executed, though the manner would be as dignified as circumstances allowed. Other Western commanders faced various fates. Some who had fought loyally for the Western cause were executed. Others who had surrendered voluntarily, or who had not been deeply committed to the Western cause, were treated more leniently, sometimes even allowed to retain reduced versions of their domains. Ieyasu understood that excessive harshness would breed resentment and future resistance, while measured mercy could transform former enemies into loyal vassals. Kobayakawa Hideaki, whose defection had been so crucial to the Eastern victory, received rewards as promised, additional territories and honors. But he would die young, just 2 years later, and some sources suggest the guilt of his betrayal haunted him, though such accounts may be later embellishments meant to moralize about the costs of broken faith. The Battle of Sekigahara was over. It had lasted about 6 hours, from mid-morning until early afternoon. Casualties were estimated between 30 and 40,000, though precise figures are impossible to determine. It was one of the largest battles in Japanese history, and certainly the most decisive. But its importance lay not in the tactical details, or even in the casualties, but in its consequences. The battle had determined who would rule Japan. The system Toyotomi Hideyoshi had created, meant to be governed collectively by the Council of 5 Elders on behalf of his son, was finished. The only question now was what system would replace it, and how the victor would use his newfound supremacy. As darkness fell over Sekigahara on October 21st, 1600, lanterns were lit in Ieyasu's camp. Commanders gathered to report and receive orders. Messages were prepared to be sent across Japan, informing allies of the victory and summoning those who had remained neutral to declare their loyalty. Guards were posted and watches set. And Ieyasu, after a long day that had determined the course of history, finally allowed himself to rest. Though his work was far from finished, the battle was won. But building the peace would require everything he had learned in 58 years of life: patience, wisdom, careful judgment, and the understanding that true victory came not in defeating one's enemies, but in creating conditions where enmity itself became unnecessary. The autumn rains came to Sekigahara in the days after the battle, washing the field clean in ways both literal and symbolic. The armies dispersed, the eastern forces to secure their victory, the remnants of the western army to whatever fate awaited them. Ieyasu remained for a time, attending to the necessary details, confirming the status of various daimyo, issuing initial orders about how the aftermath would be managed, receiving the submission of those who chose to acknowledge his supremacy, now that battle had decided the matter. The victory at Sekigahara gave Ieyasu military dominance, but military dominance alone would not suffice to govern Japan. The Sengoku period had shown clearly that power maintained only by force was unstable, constantly requiring vigilance and violence to preserve. What Japan needed, what Ieyasu understood it needed, was a structure of governance that would be seen as legitimate, that would command obedience not just through fear, but through acceptance that it represented the proper order of things. Over the following months, Ieyasu moved carefully but systematically to establish that structure. His first concern was dealing with those who had opposed him at Sekigahara. Some of the Western leaders were executed. Ishida Mitsunari and several other key commanders were put to death in Kyoto in a public ceremony that was solemn rather than celebratory. Their deaths were necessary, in Ieyasu's calculation, to demonstrate that armed resistance to his authority would not be tolerated. But executions were limited to the primary leaders. Ieyasu understood that punishing too broadly would create a class of dispossessed and resentful samurai who would become a permanent source of instability. Many daimyo who had supported the Western army were allowed to retain their positions, though often with reduced territories or relocated to different regions. Some were even eventually restored to favor if they demonstrated genuine loyalty to the new order. This policy of measured punishment and strategic forgiveness helped to minimize resistance and brought former enemies into the new system. The redistribution of territories after Sekigahara was massive and carefully planned. Daimyo who had supported Ieyasu were rewarded with additional lands or better positioned domains. Those who had remained neutral were sometimes penalized with reductions in their holdings. Neutrality in the conflict, Ieyasu made clear, had not been a legitimate choice. and those domains whose lords had died or been punished were redistributed to vassals whose loyalty was assured. The result was a thorough reorganization of political geography that strengthened Ieyasu's position enormously. Strategic regions were placed under the control of trusted allies. Potential threats were isolated, with their territories surrounded by loyal domains, and the overall pattern created a system where any future resistance would face overwhelming force from multiple directions. During this period, Ieyasu also focused on securing the position of the Toyotomi house, particularly young Hideyori, in ways that were respectful but also carefully limiting. Hideyori remained in Osaka Castle with substantial resources and honors befitting the son of Japan's previous paramount lord. Ieyasu treated him with public deference and maintained the fiction that he was simply managing affairs on Hideyori's behalf. But the reality was clear to anyone paying attention. Real power had passed to Ieyasu, and Hideyori's role was increasingly ceremonial. In 1603, 3 years after Sekigahara, Ieyasu took the step that formalized his supremacy. He accepted the title of shogun. This required careful diplomatic work with the imperial court in Kyoto, as the shogunate was an imperial appointment that only the emperor could grant. But the emperor, living in reduced circumstances and dependent on the goodwill of whoever held real power, was willing to grant what Ieyasu requested. On March 24, 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was officially appointed Sei Tashogun, Commander-in-Chief for the pacification of the East, the title that marked him as Japan's supreme military and political authority. The title was significant not just for the power it represented, but for its historical resonance. The last effective shogunate had been the Ashikaga, which had collapsed into irrelevance during the Sengoku period. By claiming the title, Ieyasu was positioning himself as the restorer of an ancient and legitimate form of governance, not as a revolutionary, but as someone who was bringing back proper order after a century of chaos. This appeal to tradition and legitimacy was crucial for acceptance across Japanese society. But Ieyasu made a surprising move just 2 years later, in 1605. He resigned the position of shogun and passed the title to his son, Hidetada. This was not a surrender of power. Ieyasu remained the dominant figure in Japanese politics, now holding the title of Ogosho, retired shogun, which still commanded enormous authority. Rather, it was a carefully calculated decision to establish the principle that the shogunate was hereditary in the Tokugawa family, not dependent on Ieyasu's personal authority alone. By having Hidetada appointed shogun while Ieyasu was still active and able to guide events, he established that the position would pass within his family according to succession rules, not be contested after his death. This was exactly the kind of foresight that Hideyoshi had lacked. Hideyoshi had died, leaving only a young child as heir, creating the power vacuum that had led to Sekigahara. Ieyasu was determined not to repeat that mistake. The relationship between father and son was complex during these years. Hidetada held the title and performed many of the ceremonial and administrative functions of the shogunate, but major decisions were still made by Ieyasu or in close consultation with him. Hidetada had been raised for leadership, but he was naturally more cautious than his father, less willing to take risks, more concerned with precedent and proper form. This actually suited Ieyasu's purposes. A shogun who valued stability and procedure would be less likely to pursue ambitious policies that might disrupt the peace. During this period, Ieyasu established many of the systems and structures that would define the Tokugawa shogunate for the next 2.5 centuries. The Sankin Kotai system, which required daimyo to maintain residences in Edo and to spend alternating years in the capital, was formalized. This system served multiple purposes. It allowed the shogunate to monitor the daimyo closely. It kept their families as de facto hostages, ensuring good behavior, and it forced them to spend resources on travel and maintaining establishments in Edo, rather than on building military forces or fortifications. The classification of daimyo into different categories, Fudai, who were long-time Tokugawa allies, Tozama, who were outside lords who had submitted only after Sekigahara, and Shinpan, who were Tokugawa family branches, created a clear hierarchy that determined political access and responsibility. Fudai daimyo received key administrative positions in the shogunate and were considered most trustworthy. Tozama lords, while powerful, were kept at arm's length politically and had their domains positioned strategically far from Edo and from each other. Shinpan provided a pool of potential heirs if the direct line failed and served as reliable military resources. Ieyasu also worked to secure foreign trade relationships while carefully controlling foreign influence. Portugal and the Netherlands were allowed to trade at Nagasaki, bringing goods and wealth, but under strict supervision. Christianity, which had gained significant numbers of converts during the late 16th century, was viewed with increasing suspicion as potentially subversive to the social order, and persecution of Christians would intensify in later years, though the heaviest persecution came after Ieyasu's time. Throughout all this, Ieyasu maintained his base at Sumpu, modern-day Shizuoka, while Hidetada governed from Edo. Sumpu Castle became the de facto center of power, where major daimyo came to pay their respects, where important decisions were made, where Ieyasu held court in a style that was formal but less elaborate than traditional imperial ceremonies, befitting a warrior who valued substance over display. He also focused on cultural and intellectual development, understanding that lasting governance required more than military strength and political structure. He encouraged the printing and distributions of books, particularly Chinese classics and Buddhist texts. He supported Confucian scholars whose emphasis on hierarchy, loyalty, and moral cultivation aligned with the values he wanted to promote. He sponsored temple construction and restoration projects, and he maintained the tea ceremony and other traditional arts as important expressions of cultivated leadership. But one challenge remained unresolved: the Toyotomi house. Young Hideyori had grown into a capable young man by the 1610s, and he remained in Osaka Castle with considerable resources and the loyalty of samurai who remembered his father, Hideyoshi. As long as Hideyori existed as a potential alternative center of power, the Tokugawa position was not completely secure. Some of Ieyasu's advisors argued for direct action to eliminate this potential threat, while others suggested that Hideyori, properly managed, could be integrated into the new system. Ieyasu initially tried the integrative approach. he arranged a marriage between Hideyori and his own granddaughter, creating a family tie that should have bound the houses together. He provided honors and reassurances that Hideyori's position was secure. But tensions gradually increased, fed by those around Hideyori who resented Tokugawa dominance and by the shogunate's own concerns about potential rebellion. In 1614, a crisis erupted over the inscription on a bell at a temple that Hideyori had sponsored. The inscription included characters that could be read as an insult to Ieyasu, though whether this was intentional or coincidental remains debated. Ieyasu seized on this incident as a pretext, demanding explanations and concessions that he knew Hideyori and his advisors would find difficult to accept. The result was the siege of Osaka, which actually consisted of 2 campaigns, the winter campaign of 1614 and the summer campaign of 1615. These were the last major military actions of Ieyasu's life, and they were conducted with all the resources and skill he had accumulated over 60 years. The shogunate assembled an enormous army, perhaps 200,000 men, and laid siege to Osaka Castle, one of the most formidable fortifications in Japan. The winter campaign ended in a negotiated settlement, with Hideyori agreeing to certain conditions and the shogunate's forces withdrawing. But the peace was fragile. By spring of 1615, tensions had risen again, and the summer campaign began. This time, there would be no negotiation. The shogunate forces attacked in strength, breached the castle's defenses, and overwhelmed the defenders. Hideyori died in the battle's aftermath, either in the fighting or by his own hand. His son was executed, ending the direct Toyotomi line. Osaka Castle was badly damaged and later rebuilt under Tokugawa control. The siege was devastating but decisive. The last potential alternative to Tokugawa rule had been eliminated. The way was now completely clear for the shogunate to govern without rival. Ieyasu had not personally participated in the most intense fighting. At 73, he was too old for that. But he had directed the campaigns and had been present throughout, lending his authority and experience to the effort. The victory at Osaka completed what Sekigahara had begun, the absolute supremacy of the Tokugawa house. With this final obstacle removed, Ieyasu could turn his attention to ensuring that everything he had built would last. He spent his remaining time refining the administrative systems, advising Hidetada on governance, settling disputes among daimyo, and preparing the succession for the generation beyond Hidetada. He had achieved what had seemed impossible in the chaos of his youth. He had united Japan under stable governance, ended those wars that had defined the Sengoku period, and established a system that would preserve peace for centuries. Looking back from the vantage point of 1615, the path seemed almost inevitable, from hostage child to paramount lord, from the chaos of warring states to unified peace. But Ieyasu knew better. He knew how many times events could have turned differently, how many decisions had required careful judgment, how much had depended on patience, timing, and the accumulated wisdom of experience. He had been fortunate in many ways, certainly, but he had also made his own fortune through choices that valued the long view over immediate gain, substance over flash, stability over glory. The title of shogun, which he had held briefly before passing it to his son, was now securely established as a Tokugawa inheritance. The systems of governance were in place, the daimyo were organized and controlled, the economy was developing, the culture was flourishing, and most importantly, the warfare had ended. Farmers could plant without fear that armies would trample their crops. Merchants could trade without wondering which warlord would control the roads. Families could raise children without expecting to lose them to battles that seemed to have no end. This was Ieyasu's true victory, not the battlefield triumphs, though those had been necessary, but the peace he had created and the structures he had built to preserve it. In a few short years, he would be gone. But what he had established would endure, shaping Japan through centuries yet to come, and his name would be remembered not primarily as a warrior, but as the architect of an age of peace. In the final years of his life, Ieyasu turned his attention fully to the work of consolidation and construction. Not construction of castles and fortifications, which were now largely unnecessary, but construction of the administrative, legal, and cultural frameworks that would sustain peace once he was gone. The Tokugawa shogunate that emerged from these efforts was remarkably comprehensive and sophisticated, touching every aspect of the Japanese life from the highest-ranking daimyo to the smallest village. It was a system built on hierarchy and order, on clearly defined relationships and responsibilities, on the principle that stability required everyone to know their place and fulfill their obligations. At the apex stood the shogun himself, now Hidetada, though everyone understood that Ieyasu still wielded ultimate authority. Below the shogun, the daimyo were organized into the three categories Ieyasu had established: Fudai, Tozama, and Shinpan. Each category had different privileges and restrictions. Fudai lords could hold positions in the shogunate's central administration and were stationed in strategic locations. Tozama lords, though they controlled some of the largest and wealthiest domains, were excluded from high administrative office and were watched carefully for any sign of disloyalty. Shinpan provided support and emergency backup for the main Tokugawa line. The Sankin-kotai system, which required daimyo to alternate residence between their domains and Edo, was now fully implemented. Every 2 years, each lord would travel to Edo with an appropriate retinue, conduct his business in the capital, and then return home while his family remained in Edo as guarantees of his good behavior. The system worked brilliantly as a control mechanism. It kept the daimyo under observation, prevented them from building up military forces in their domains, and drained their resources through the enormous expenses of maintaining establishments in Edo and conducting the elaborate processions between their territories and the capital. But the system also had beneficial effects that perhaps Ieyasu had not fully anticipated. The regular movement of these processions created a constant demand for goods and services along the major roads, stimulating economic development in towns that lay along the routes. The presence of daimyo and their retainers in Edo for half the year created a consumer market that encouraged craft production and trade. And the mixing of people from different regions in the capital helped to create a more unified Japanese culture, breaking down some of the regional isolation that had characterized earlier eras. Ieyasu also established detailed regulations governing every aspect of daimyo behavior. The buke shohato, or laws for the military houses, specified rules for castle construction and repair, marriage alliances, military preparedness, relations with the imperial court, and proper conduct in countless situations. Violations could result in punishment ranging from fines to loss of territory to forced suicide for serious offences. But the regulations were generally clear and consistent, which made them possible to follow, and they applied to everyone within their scope, creating a sense of predictability that had been absent during the Sengoku period. Below the daimyo, the samurai class was now clearly defined and regulated. Samurai were forbidden from engaging in commerce or agriculture. Their role was service to their lords, whether in military, administrative, or ceremonial capacities. They retained the right to carry 2 swords, a visible symbol of their status, while commoners were restricted to carrying only short blades for practical purposes. This clear visual distinction helped maintain social boundaries and reinforced the hierarchy. But with this elevated status came responsibilities. Samurai were expected to be literate, to study the Confucian classics, to cultivate themselves morally and intellectually. The idealized samurai was not just a warrior, but a scholar warrior, someone who could compose poetry, conduct tea ceremony with proper aesthetics, and manage administrative duties with efficiency and integrity. Many domains established schools for samurai sons, teaching both martial arts and classical learning. Below the samurai came the 3 commoner classes, theoretically ranked according to Confucian principles: farmers, artisans, and merchants. Farmers were ranked highest among commoners because they produced the rice that sustained everyone. Artisans were ranked second because they created useful objects. Merchants were ranked lowest because they merely moved goods around without producing anything, though in practice merchants often accumulated considerable wealth and influence that belied their low theoretical status. This 4-class system was not perfectly rigid. There was some movement between classes, and within each class there were numerous gradations. But it provided a basic framework that organized society and gave everyone a place within the larger whole. And importantly, it was backed by law and custom that made crossing class boundaries difficult and transgression of class norms potentially punishable. For agriculture, the foundation of the economy, Ieyasu implemented policies designed to ensure stable production and fair taxation. The land surveys that Hideyoshi had begun were maintained and refined, creating accurate records of each domain's productive capacity. Taxes were assessed as a percentage of production, typically around 40 to 50% collected in rice. This was burdensome for farmers, but relatively consistent and predictable, which was an improvement over the chaos of the Sengoku period, when armies might simply take whatever they wanted. Villages were made collectively responsible for meeting their tax obligations, which encouraged communities to work together and to manage their affairs efficiently. Village headmen became important figures, mediating between the farmers and higher authorities, organizing the agricultural work and ensuring that obligations were met. This system gave villages a degree of autonomy in managing their internal affairs while binding them firmly to the larger political structure. Trade and commerce flourished under the peace that the Tokugawa established. Roads were improved and maintained. Checkpoints were established to control movement and collect tolls, but they also provided security against bandits, making travel safer than it had been for generations. The Tokaido, the road connecting Edo to Kyoto, became one of the most traveled routes in the world, lined with post stations offering accommodations and services to the constant flow of travelers. Edo itself grew with remarkable speed. When Ieyasu had first established his headquarters there, it had been a relatively small castle town. By the 1620s, just 2 decades later, it had become one of Japan's largest cities, with a population approaching 500,000. The city was carefully planned and organized, with districts designated for different purposes. Samurai residential areas near the castle, merchant districts for commerce, temple districts for religion, pleasure quarters for entertainment. The castle at the center was enormous, surrounded by massive stone walls and elaborate gates, its main tower visible from miles away. The shogunate's administrative offices were located within the castle complex, where officials managed the complex business of governance. And around the castle, in concentric rings, lived the various ranks of society, high-ranking daimyo in mansions closest to the castle, lower-ranking samurai farther out, and commoners in the outer districts. Ieyasu also gave attention to foreign relations, though Japan's engagement with the outside world was carefully controlled. Trade with China, though officially restricted, continued through indirect channels. Trade with Korea was maintained through the domain of Tsushima, which served as intermediary. The Dutch East India Company was allowed to maintain a trading post at Dejima, an artificial island in Nagasaki harbor, where they could conduct commerce under strict supervision. Christianity, however, was viewed with increasing concern. The religion had gained significant numbers of converts during the late Sengoku period, particularly in Kyushu, and some daimyo had converted. But Ieyasu and his advisors worried that Christianity's demand for loyalty to a foreign god and a foreign church could undermine the carefully constructed political order. Persecution had already begun in Ieyasu's later years, and it would intensify after his death, eventually leading to the complete prohibition of Christianity and the execution or exile of those who refused to renounce the faith. This policy, harsh as it was, reflected Ieyasu's fundamental priority, the maintenance of order and stability. Any potential source of division or alternative loyalty was seen as dangerous. This same principle led to the eventual policy of national seclusion, sakoku, which would strictly limit Japanese contact with the outside world, though this policy was not fully implemented until after Ieyasu's death. Cultural development flourished under the peace. The publishing industry grew rapidly, making books more widely available than ever before. Education spread among the samurai class and even to some commoners, creating higher literacy rates. The arts that had survived through the Sengoku period now thrived. Tea ceremony, flower arrangement, poetry, painting, theatre. New forms emerged as well, including kabuki theatre, which would become one of Japan's most distinctive art forms. Ieyasu himself, in his 70s, continued to live a disciplined life. He rose early, attended to correspondence and meetings, studied reports from across the country, provided counsel to Hidetada and other officials, and maintained the routines that had sustained him throughout his life. He practiced falconry, one of his favorite pastimes, which kept him active and connected to the natural world. He continued his study of Confucian texts and Buddhist sutras, seeking wisdom in the ancient teachings. He also spent time reflecting on his life and legacy. He had lived through extraordinary times, from the chaos of his childhood, through the unification under Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, through the conflict at Sekigahara and the establishment of his own supremacy, to this final period of consolidation. He had outlived virtually all his contemporaries. The world he had known as a young man was gone, replaced by something fundamentally different, something he had helped to create. His thoughts in these final years, one imagines, included both satisfaction and melancholy. Satisfaction at having achieved what he had set out to do, at having brought peace to a land exhausted by war, at having established systems that would preserve that peace after he was gone. But perhaps also melancholy at the costs, the friends and allies lost along the way, the compromises that leadership had required, the knowledge that all human works are temporary, that even the most carefully constructed systems will eventually change or fall. He thought about his family, his sons and grandsons who would carry on after him, his daughters married into various daimyo families, the web of relationships that bound the Tokugawa to the broader samurai class. He had worked to prepare them for leadership, to instill in them the values and skills they would need. Whether he had succeeded completely, only time would tell. He thought about the principles that had guided him: patience, persistence, careful judgment, the long view, attention to detail, care for those who served him, and the understanding that true power came not from force alone, but from creating systems that people accepted as legitimate and just. These principles had served him well, and he hoped they would guide those who came after. And he thought, perhaps, about the cycles of history, about how Japan had moved from the ancient imperial system through the rise and fall of various shogunates, through the chaos of the Sengoku period, and now to this new order that bore his name. Would it last? How long? What would cause it to eventually change or end? These questions were beyond his ability to answer, but he had done everything he could to build something durable, something that would serve the Japanese people well for as long as circumstances allowed. The Tokugawa peace, the Pax Tokugawa, was real. It would last for more than 250 years, an extraordinary period of stability in any context, but almost miraculous given Japan's recent history. There would be no major warfare, no armies marching across provinces, no castles besieged, no fields trampled by soldiers. The samurai would gradually transform from warriors into bureaucrats, their swords more symbolic than functional. Commerce would flourish, arts would develop, population would grow. And all of this would rest on the foundations that Ieyasu and his generation had laid. But that future still lay ahead. In the present, in these final years of Ieyasu's life, the work continued. Systems were refined, problems were addressed, the transition to the next generation was managed, and an old man who had begun his life as a hostage child, who had endured and persevered through 7 decades of tumultuous history, attended to his duties with the same diligence he had brought to everything since childhood. The evening sun cast long shadows across Sumpu Castle. Cherry blossoms, falling in the spring breeze, drifted past the windows of the chamber where Ieyasu met with his advisers. Outside, the city went about its business, merchants closing their shops, farmers returning from fields, samurai returning to their residences. It was a scene of ordinary peace, unremarkable in its tranquility. But that very ordinariness was the achievement. For most of Ieyasu's lifetime, such peace had been impossible, a distant dream that seemed never to arrive. Now it was reality, so solid that people were already beginning to take it for granted. And perhaps that was the greatest compliment his work could receive. That the peace he had built seemed natural, inevitable, as if it had always been this way, and always would be. The final 2 years of Tokugawa Ieyasu's life were marked by a quality that had defined him throughout, a calm attention to finishing what he had begun, ensuring that every detail was attended to, that nothing essential was left undone. He was 73 years old in 1615, having survived to an age that few of his generation reached, having outlived nearly everyone who had shaped his youth and middle years. After the siege of Osaka and the end of the Toyotomi line, Ieyasu returned to Sumpu Castle for what would be the last time. The castle stood on a hill overlooking the city, its gardens carefully maintained, its buildings elegant in their simplicity. From his rooms he could see Mount Fuji on clear days, the sacred mountain rising in perfect symmetry, snow-capped even in summer, unchanging while human affairs rose and fell around it. He continued his daily routines with the discipline that had sustained him all his life. Rising early, he would spend time in meditation, sitting in the traditional posture, attending to his breath, quieting the constant activity of the mind. This practice, which he had learned from Zen teachers over the decades, gave him clarity and centeredness, a still point in the midst of constant demands and responsibilities. After meditation, he would review reports that arrived daily from across Japan. News of harvests, accounts of disputes between vassals, updates on construction projects, summaries of trade activities, intelligence about conditions in various domains. He read everything carefully, occasionally making notes or dictating responses to his secretaries. The governance of Japan required attention to countless details, and while Hidetada was now shogun and handled most administrative matters, Ieyasu remained engaged, available to offer counsel, ready to intervene if something required his particular authority or experience. He also spent considerable time with scholars and monks, discussing texts, exploring questions of philosophy and ethics, and considering what principles should guide governance in the age of peace he had created. The Confucian emphasis on hierarchy, order, loyalty, and moral cultivation aligned well with his own instincts and with the requirements of stable governance. He encouraged the study and dissemination of these teachings, understanding that systems backed by moral philosophy and cultural values would be more stable than systems maintained only by force. But he was also pragmatic about religion. He honored Buddhism, patronized temples, and found value in Buddhist teachings about impermanence and the futility of excessive attachment. He respected Shinto traditions and understood their importance in Japanese culture. And he was tolerant of religious diversity as long as it did not threaten political stability. Only Christianity concerned him, not because of its theology, but because it demanded loyalty to institutions and authorities outside Japan's political system. During these final years, he paid particular attention to the education of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The Tokugawa line was now secure, with multiple branches and dozens of descendants who would ensure continuity. But quantity was not enough. These children needed to be prepared for leadership, to understand their responsibilities, to embody the values that would sustain the system their grandfather had built. He spent time with them personally when he could, telling stories from his own life, sharing lessons he had learned, trying to convey wisdom that could not easily be captured in formal instruction. Some of what he taught was practical: how to assess character in retainers, how to balance firmness with flexibility in governance, how to think strategically about problems. Some was moral: the importance of keeping one's word, of caring for those who depended on you, of recognizing that power was a responsibility rather than a privilege. One wonders what stories the children particularly remembered. Perhaps he told them about being a hostage as a child, about learning to endure what couldn't be changed while remaining alert for opportunities when they arose. Perhaps he described the great battles he had witnessed or participated in, though he would have stressed the waste and tragedy of warfare rather than glorifying it. Perhaps he talked about Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, the giants of the previous generation, and what he had learned from serving alongside them. And perhaps he emphasized the value of patience, of taking the long view, of understanding that great achievements that required sustained effort over years and decades rather than dramatic gestures. This lesson, so fundamental to his own approach to life, would be essential for his descendants to remember. The Tokugawa shogunate would not survive through military brilliance or charismatic leadership alone, but through steady, competent administration, through careful attention to the systems that sustained order, through patience in dealing with problems and flexibility in adapting to changing circumstances. His health, which had remained relatively robust into his 70s, began to decline in early 1616. The details are uncertain. Sources mention various ailments, and medical knowledge of the era was limited. But what is clear is that by the spring of 1616, he recognized that his time was ending. He faced this reality with the same calm acceptance he had brought to everything else, making practical arrangements, ensuring that all necessary business was completed, preparing himself for death with the attention he had given to every important transition in his life. In April 1616, as cherry blossoms were falling and the world was renewing itself with spring's energy, Ieyasu's condition worsened. His family gathered, though the formality of the era meant that even these final meetings were marked by protocol and restraint, rather than overt displays of emotion. He spoke with Hidetada, offering final counsel and confirmation that he trusted his son to continue the work they had built together. He met with key advisors, expressing his confidence in them and his appreciation for their service. He attended to religious observances, ensuring he was prepared spiritually for what lay ahead. On April 17, 1616, Tokugawa Ieyasu died at Sumpu Castle. He was 74 years old. By the standards of his era, he had lived a remarkably long life, having survived countless dangers that had killed many of his contemporaries. He had been a hostage, a warrior, a daimyo, and finally shogun, the paramount lord of a united Japan. He had witnessed the end of the Sengoku period and the beginning of a peace that would last for centuries. His death was announced across Japan with the solemnity appropriate to the passing of the nation's supreme leader. Temples held memorial services, daimyo sent condolences, and conducted ceremonies in their domains. The imperial court in Kyoto issued proclamations recognizing his achievements. And throughout Japan, people absorbed the news, wondering what his death might mean for the future, but also recognizing that the systems he had established were strong enough to survive the loss of their creator. His body was initially buried at Kunozan, and a shrine was erected there. Later, in accordance with his wishes and after elaborate preparations, his remains were moved to Nikko, in the mountains north of Edo, where a magnificent shrine complex would be built in his honor. The Toshogu Shrine at Nikko became one of Japan's most important religious sites, a place where people came to honor the man who had brought peace to the land, to pray for prosperity and protection, and to remember the achievements that had transformed Japanese history. But Ieyasu's true monument was not the shrine, magnificent as it was. His true monument was the peace itself, the system of governance that would function effectively for more than 250 years, the longest period of stability in Japanese history. No major war would be fought on Japanese soil from Sekigahara in 1600 until the upheavals of the 19th century forced Japan to confront the modern world. The Tokugawa shogunate would govern with remarkable consistency, adapting to circumstances, but maintaining its fundamental character, providing order and predictability that allowed Japanese society to develop without the disruption of constant warfare. The culture that flourished during the Tokugawa period, the art, literature, theater, philosophy, crafts, and refinement of daily life, all rested on the peace that Ieyasu had established. Edo would grow into one of the world's largest cities. Commerce would create wealth and a sophisticated urban culture. Literacy would spread widely. The arts would reach extraordinary levels of development. And while the rigid social hierarchy created its own problems and costs, it also provided stability that allowed creativity and economic development to flourish in ways that would have been impossible amid continued warfare. The samurai class would gradually transform during these centuries of peace. Without wars to fight, they became administrators, scholars, and artists. The martial traditions were maintained through training and ceremony, but the reality was that most samurai would live their entire lives without ever drawing their swords in anger. This transformation from warrior to bureaucrat was itself a kind of victory, a demonstration that the system was working, that peace was real and lasting. Not everything about the Tokugawa system was admirable. The rigid social hierarchy limited human potential and freedom. The eventual policy of national isolation cut Japan off from developments in the rest of the world, which would create problems when that isolation ended. The peace was maintained partly through surveillance and control that restricted individual liberty. And the system's very stability eventually made it difficult to adapt when circumstances demanded change. But in the context of what had come before, more than a century of warfare, uncertainty, and constant danger, the Tokugawa peace represented an extraordinary achievement. For the farmer working his fields, for the merchant conducting business, for the artisan perfecting his craft, for families raising children, the peace meant everything. It meant being able to plan for the future with reasonable confidence that those plans would not be overturned by armies marching through. It meant that hard work would likely be rewarded, that children might have better lives than their parents, that the world had some predictability and order. This was what Ieyasu had understood fundamentally, that what people needed most was not dramatic heroism or revolutionary change, but steady governance, fair treatment, predictable rules, and the security to build their lives without fear that everything would be destroyed by forces beyond their control. He had provided this through patient building over decades, through careful attention to systems and structures, through subordinating his own ego to the larger goal of creating something that would last. Looking back at his life from the perspective of his death, one sees a trajectory that was neither simple nor inevitable, but rather marked by constant adaptation to circumstances, by learning from both success and failure, by patience exercised over 7 decades. From the terrified child torn from his family at age 4, through the young samurai learning to survive in others' courts, through the ally of Nobunaga and the vassal of Hideyoshi, through the victor of Sekigahara and the founder of the shogunate, to the old man ensuring his work would survive him. The journey was long and arduous, requiring qualities that are easier to describe than to embody. Patience, certainly, but not passive patience. Active patience, the patience to wait for the right moment while constantly preparing for that moment, maintaining readiness while not forcing issues before they were ripe. Wisdom, but wisdom earned through experience rather than innate brilliance, the wisdom that comes from making mistakes and learning from them, from observing others and understanding what worked and what did not, from accumulating knowledge over decades. Loyalty, but pragmatic loyalty, faithful to allies and retainers, but not blind, recognizing when circumstances had changed and required new approaches. And perhaps above all, a sense of responsibility, the deep understanding that his choices affected thousands and eventually millions of people, that carelessness or self-indulgence on his part could destroy what so many had worked to build. The sun sets over Mount Fuji, painting the snow-capped peak in shades of pink and gold. In a village below, a farmer finishes his day's work and returns to his home, where his family waits with the evening meal. In Edo, merchants close their shops and count the day's earnings, making plans for tomorrow's business. In a castle town, a young samurai practices his calligraphy by lantern light, copying characters from a classical text, honing both his skill and his understanding. In a temple, a monk strikes a bell that echoes across the darkening landscape, marking the transition from day to night. These quiet scenes, repeated in countless variations across Japan, represent the triumph of Tokugawa Ieyasu, more truly than any battle or ceremony could. This is the peace he created, the world he built. Not perfect, certainly, not without its problems and limitations, but vastly better than the chaos that had preceded it, and stable enough to last for centuries. His life spanned the transformation of Japan from fragmentation to unity, from constant warfare to enduring peace, from chaos to order. He was not the most brilliant general of his era, not the most charismatic leader, not the most innovative thinker. But he was the one who endured, who built carefully and patiently, who understood that true success was measured not in dramatic moments, but in creating systems that would function long after their creator was gone. The cherry blossoms fall, as they do every spring, petals drifting on the breeze, beautiful in their brief moment before they return to the earth. The blossoms remind us that all things are temporary, that life moves in cycles, that even the greatest achievements will eventually fade into history. But they also remind us that beauty and meaning exist in the present moment, that the temporary nature of things does not diminish their value, that we can create something worthwhile, even knowing it will not last forever. Tokugawa Ieyasu lived 74 years in a difficult age, and in those years he changed his country's history. He brought peace to a land exhausted by war. He built systems that would govern Japan for generations. He demonstrated that patience, wisdom, and steady effort could achieve what force and brilliance alone couldn't. And when his time came to rest, he could do so, knowing that his work was complete, that what he had built would endure, that the peace he had created was real and lasting. May you rest well tonight, in a world that still benefits from the understanding that peace is built slowly, carefully, by those who value the long view over immediate gratification, by those who understand that the greatest achievements often come not with drama, but with quiet, persistent attention to building something that will serve those who come after.